Femme Fatale says, "Oh, nice you're back on." Allspeak says, "Yuppin' on YouTube."
Femme Fatale says I can't hear it.
You hear it now?
A position to support our position and to prove that we disagree
I can hear you, not at the video.
with knowledge
How about the video now?
rather than without knowledge.
Okay, now I can...
can't imagine a more delightful example of this situation
This might sound
than that which relates to the Hermetic literature. For in this we have a wonderful disagreement. We have the most learned persons over a period
I can't
of
hear you over the video.
1800 years
All right, one moment.
in violent disagreement.
That's probably too loud.
Each of these positions has been taken with skill. Most of the authorities have done everything in their power to ferret out the facts. When
That
we
should be
say
better.
everything in their power, we place certain provisions. For it is not in the power of any person to go completely against conviction. And most of the erroneous opinions that we have
Unless
in
you
life
speak louder.
arise from prejudice, from some bias or limitation by which it is impossible for us to think
This
clearly
is pretty loud.
and freely,
Or
and to
maybe I
examine
should
all
I
facts
could
upon their
change,
own
make
merit
it a little
alone.
lower.
We are conditioned by our living, by our thinking, by our education.
I can't hear it.
our
I can
environment.
hear you now.
And
Okay,
these
now.
Blazer
conditioning
says,
factors
I
Seems
can't hear
begin
you
upon
over
our
the
thinking
video unless you speak
and frequently
louder.
distort. Therefore, if a person researching in some field belongs to a school that has strong prejudices, he has already lost his own freedom of thinking, his own individual directive. We'll begin with a discussion to be found in the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria.
What are we listening
This
to?
writer was alive and at work as a literary man between about
Same guy. Manly P.
175
Hall. Talking about
and 220 AD.
hermetic rituals
He belongs
lost
to the great group
from the past.
of Ante-Nicene fathers, writing, of course, strongly from an early Christian prejudice. Yet he was living with the peoples of Egypt. He knew them, and in many instances, in most cases, there was a strong streak of honesty in the things that he stated, although there could be much bias in his interpretation of facts. He was reasonably correct on his basic facts. He describes a procession in Egypt, which apparently he had seen, a sacred ritualistic procession involving the custodians and bearers of the books of Hermes. He describes how a procession of priests and savants, teachers, moved in very sacred ritualistic order, each with an appropriate symbol and wearing certain insignia indicating the department of learning over which he presided. Clement also says that to earn these distinctions of learning, it was necessary for these scribes, scholars, and priests to have memorized certain books of Hermes, some 3 books, some 4 books, some 10 books. These various religious and philosophical teachers, also carried emblems relating to the branches of learning over which they presided. Therefore, some of them had become masters of the medical books of Hermes, others of those books dealing with statesmanship and law and the government of peoples, others still of astronomy, mathematics, navigation, and the secrets of the heavens, and the geography of the earth, still others in turn of philosophy, of the deeper mysteries of the mind, of those sciences which are speculative, inductive, or theoretic, and still others bearing those books and insignias which indicated that they were students of the divine mysteries concerning the nature of God, of deity, of the state religion, of the secondary deities and tutelaries, and all things which had to do with theology. Adding together the books specifically referred to by number but not by name by Clement, we find clear statement of 42 books, divided apparently into a wide variety of subjects. In short and simple, covering practically every field of knowledge known in the ancient world. Now we have here several facts of importance. The first is that Clement writes apparently as an eyewitness to these rituals, taking them for granted, and his contemporaries must have known whether he was correct or not, and it is unlikely that he would have perpetrated a fraud. It would have been too easy to detect it, and some other writers would certainly have come out violently against it. The second important point is dating, namely that this procession occurred probably not later than 220 AD, and possibly as early as 150 AD. This gives us a kind of orientation, which brings us violently into conflict with one of the greatest antiquarians of his time, Fabricius. He declares it to be his most solemn and sincere conviction that the Hermetic books could not have been written prior to the year AD 300. Now here we come head on into one of our least minor problems. Is it conceivable that Fabricius was not aware of the statement by Clement? This is almost impossible. Had he not noted it himself, someone else would have brought it to his attention. He was working at a time when literature was not as abundant as it is now. Men did not overlook source books centuries ago, when these constituted practically the sum total of authority. Therefore, we try to understand why Fabricius took his position. The answer is obvious from other authorities working in the field. According to this answer, Fabricius assumes that the books carried by the Egyptians in their religious procession could not have been the present books that we now associate with Hermes. Fabricius would be inclined to follow the school with which he had greatest fondness, and take it for granted that the books referred to must have been primarily Egyptian, that these books must have been in the Egyptian philosophy, in the Egyptian religion, and almost certainly in the Egyptian glyphic writings. He, on the other hand, Fabricius, takes the position that the Hermetic books that we know today were undoubtedly written in Greek. Now, where we do not have many facts, positions can be strongly held. His position is sustained by the evidence of his time, but there were two things he didn't know. He couldn't know. One was the discovery in 1946 of the Canoboskian library near Luxor, about 30 miles from Luxor in Egypt. This library proves conclusively that the Hermetic books were in existence prior to AD 300. And the general opinion now is that the manuscripts discovered will probably date from the middle of the 3rd century AD or perhaps the beginning of that century. In other words, these books are practically contemporary with Clement of Alexandria, the man we quoted first. Now, the position that the Hermetic books had to have been written in Egyptian is also assailed by another fact, a fact which perhaps Fabricius did not adequately examine. That is, that considerably earlier, a Greek dynasty of pharaohs had taken over the administration of Egypt, and Egypt was already passing from Egyptian learning to Greek learning. This we evidence from the appearance of the Septuagint version of the Bible, which was actually prepared in Greek in Egypt, probably in the middle of the 4th century BC. Therefore, to say that Greek could not have originated in Egypt prior to the 4th century AD is no longer a tenable hypothesis. Also, we have another interesting point, one that we cannot overlook. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone gave us our first real clue to the Egyptian language. And it is important to us because it is a bilingual inscription in Egyptian glyphs and in Greek. Now, this is important to us for two reasons. First, because this stone was cut or prepared approximately 200 BC. The second point of interest is that this stone actually carries the name of Hermes. It is one of the words, of course, in the Egyptian form, Thoth. But it also carries another very interesting peculiarity by which we divide the Egyptian Thothic literature from the true Hermetic structure. We most of us realize or remember that Hermes is generally referred to in the Hermetic writings as Mercurius or Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest. And in some of the earlier works, this is modified a little, and he is called the twice greatest. But always this peculiar appellation of more than great accompanies the peculiar use of the term in the Hermetic literature. On the Rosetta Stone, the reference to Thoth is Thoth, great, great. In other words, twice great. And this carries with it an implication that is so close to our Hermetic problem that we cannot ignore it. Also, we know, therefore, that 200 BC, a sufficient study had been made and a sufficient interest had been created that a bilingual inscription relating to matters of importance had already assumed the proportion of a necessity. And in Egypt, Greek and Egyptian were both languages needed in the administration of the state 200 years BC. This brings the next point that involves itself in our peculiar situation. How early could these books have been compiled? Here another group of authorities move in. The effort now being to collate or to relate certain words and structure in the writings of Hermes with the existing versions of the Bible. This opens an interesting problem, and it is now generally regarded as likely, from the peculiar use of terms, that the author of the Hermetic works was to some degree acquainted with the Old Testament. The quotations that he appears to use, or the similarities which arise, are clearly to the Septuagint version. or the version that was actually prepared in Egypt. Also, references to the New Testament have been variously traced and implied, and this opens another interesting situation. Namely, that perhaps the author was acquainted with the New Testament, but the evidence to sustain this is less strong than that he was acquainted with the Old Testament. This brings another group of authorities into the picture, namely the recognition that ancient works passing downward over periods of time are frequently changed. A scribe or a translator working with a document and with certain liberty to either polish or refine the style of that document is very likely to fall into idiom, the idiom of his own time. Our outstanding example of that, of course, is the King James Version of the Bible. This version, prepared and published first in 1611, is a masterful translation into English. Yet any scholar examining the King James Version would date it almost certainly into the opening years of the 17th century. Not because the original content belongs to that period, but because in the translation it has fallen into the idiomatic forms current at the time the translations were made. This can also have occurred in connection with the Hermetic writings. It is not at all impossible that versions or variants of these writings may have appeared at several times, and that these various editions might have been some in Egyptian, some in Greek, and that those in Greek, probably made by scholars, could easily be influenced by dominant books in the field of the literature of that time. So out of this entire rather involved and at the same time interesting detective story, we come to a series of rather negative facts. Actually, no authority has as yet clearly proven his point. It is not absolutely certain that words or peculiar constructions paralleling the Septuagint could not have come into the Hermetic writings at a time of their translation or transliteration from the Egyptian glyphs. Scribes and scholars could have polished the work in the temper of their own days. Nor is it at all impossible that other versions of the work may have been tampered with after the beginning of the Christian era. It is quite conceivable that efforts would be made by certain groups and certain sects to twist or move this group of literature into the Christian camp. On the other hand, certain other groups might have done everything possible to delete Old Testament parallels for various reasons. And later, in the period of the heresies, each translation...
When science reaches its end, it's like the snake that bites its own tail. It's looking into impenetrable darkness. It realizes science is never going to tell us the ground of being. It comes full circle back to where it started, which is this resignation and this need for myth. We've come to the end of this mathematical quest. It brought us back to the Platonic cosmology of the soul of the universe being this infinitely dense point in the center, which somehow occupies each point of the encompassing sphere, where the past, present, and future are conserved. They radiate in on these strings of energy to create this holographic illusion. Brian Greene, the famous string theorist, explicitly compared this to Plato's cave allegory.
Oh, wow. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. After even a glancing dip into ancient epics, myths, tragedies, Platonic dialogues, it's pretty clear there is a lot going on beneath the surface. There are layers of intended hidden meanings, layers of possible hidden meanings and interpretations, which makes it quite possible to drive yourself a touch bonkers exploring the depths of these works. But it's a fun kind of bonkers portal to get slurped into, at least for me. And on that note, given the fact that we are diving beneath the surface of two classic works, Euripides' The Bacchae and Plato's Republic, this is not a casual mind melt. This is somewhat of a brain melter. This is fairly esoteric territory. It's going to require you to focus in on some names and archetypes and themes if you really want to grok the gold that's being presented. And for that reason, I've decided to do something a little special with this episode. I've added quite a number of accompanying images and names to help lubricate your entry into this territory, or maybe it's entering you. Either way, not a bad idea to have some lubrication, right? There's also a chart I've got linked in the comments that maps out a bunch of the key connections between these texts. Anyway, that aforementioned mythopoetic gold and that chart are not mine to take credit for, my friends. This is the work of the brilliant Dr. Timothy Owen Desmond. He is a philosopher, professor, author of Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. It is excellent, thought-provoking stuff. Do dive into it and dive into our previous mind melts for more on that. All the links for Tim, his book, and his course, which looks absolutely stellar, by the way, are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on that note, like, subscribe, comment, share, tickle the algorithm in all ways. It does do the channel an assist. Also, do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got hundreds of episodes with truly brilliant beings, and they will never go up here on YouTube. And if you want to not only support these transmissions, but meld minds with me directly along with hundreds of other truly sweet seekers, enter the Wonder Lodge at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server book club. We do live hangs on Zoom. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. I do hope to meld minds with you there. But presently, let's do so with Timothy Owen Desmond. The mystery that is Platonism and the Platonic corpus, in particular, the Republic, where you find, famous allegory of the cave, among so many other things. But one of the things I just wanted to bring up at the beginning is when we look at these texts like the Republic, it looks on the surface like it's a book about the ideal city-state, right? And in a sense it is. But then if you look deeper, there's all of these esoteric layers to a point where we are now well over 2,300, 400 years since this book is written, and we still don't fully understand this thing. Like, we still have not fully decoded, all of the esoteric geometry and references and things going on in this text. So I thought a fun question to just query you with from the outset is, what do you really think these texts are? Or maybe even just the Republic itself. Like, what do you think the Republic really is?
I think it's a lot of things. I think I would like to read something that Friedrich Nietzsche said about Plato in The Birth of Tragedy out of the Spirit of Music. He says, if tragedy had absorbed into itself all the earlier types of art, the same might also be said in an eccentric sense of the Platonic dialogue, which, a mixture of all extant styles and forms, hovers midway between narrative, lyric, and drama, between prose and poetry, and so has also broken the strict old law of the unity of linguistic form. The Platonic dialogue was, as it were, the barge on which the shipwrecked ancient poetry saved herself with all her children, crowded into a narrow space and timidly submitting to the single pilot Socrates. They now sailed into a new world, which never tired of looking at the fantastic spectacle of this procession. So Nietzsche was saying in Plato's dialogues, all of the previous forms of Greek literature and the tragic and comic plays and Homer especially were combined.
Yeah.
And forced to follow the Socratic method of dialectic, of rational analysis, seeking to break the argument down to the archetypes, the fundamental ideas imprinted on the soul. But in addition to that, or included in that, by including all these other ancient Greek literary forms, it is also a kind of a ritualistic guide. For a careful reader, the mythic subtexts, these literary parallels with Homer and Euripides, is what we'll be talking about, his tragic play, the Bacchae, those were inspired by the mystery religions.
Yeah.
And I'm going to focus on the Orphic mystery religion, which was supposed to open up the eye of your soul to God, or what Plato called the idea of the good, and that would help you overcome the fear of death by helping you realize that you're an eternal soul.
Yeah. And
so I think that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, man. Yeah. You know, it occurred to me when I was making that cave video that, you know, we look at megalithic structures like the pyramids and we just think, wow, we don't really have a clue what leads to something like this. You know, there's tons of theories. Just by me saying that, there's going to be so many people who want to write, it's this, it's that, it's this. We don't know for certain what would lead a culture to do something that is so intensively difficult from not only a physical standpoint, but just so mathematically precise. You know, there's been so much work done on like all of the different geometry it displays and how it like perfectly matches like how the three great pyramids of Giza match the three stars that comprise the belt of Orion or Osiris in the cosmos. How it encodes like the size of the Earth, all of these different things, right?
Right.
I really think the Republic is a literary version of something like that, where it's so every single syllable, and this has been proven by the way, that every single syllable was like toiled over and put there for a very specific reason. And like if you really want to go down this rabbit hole, there's this researcher named John Bremer who I mentioned in that video who apparently counted by hand like every single syllable in the Republic,
Right.
so that he could show that there was purposeful references being made under the surface to music theory, to geometry, to all of these other things, but in a way where it is never stated in the text. But you get these crazy coincidences that are too impossible to dismiss, where like right on, and I believe this is an actual example, where like right on the perfect octave, like the midway point of the text, it says like the word you find is musicae.
Right.
Like, is the word music or something like that. And also he talks about the divided line, which encodes the golden ratio at the perfect golden ratio dividing point of the entire text. So,
Right.
so things like this that you're not going to find unless you do these almost like, you know, autistic level deep dives of obsessive just laboring over the thing. And then when you are rewarded for it like that, I mean, God, like the levels of either just psychosis or synchronicity, or maybe there's no difference between those two things at a certain point, like that you encounter are just insane. And it's there. I mean, the stuff is there. And that's why I wanted to ask you that question of like, what do you think these things are? Because they're just, I completely agree with what you're saying, that they're certainly not just what they appear to be on the surface.
No.
But what's amazing to me is that they are what they are on the surface. Like they're perfectly coherent on the surface, but they're even more coherent the more time you spend with them in ways that I still can't imagine, because I haven't stumbled across these things organically. I've had people tell me or read about them or whatever. And I just, man, it's like, it's kind of the same feeling I get when I look at Carl Jung's Red Book or something, where I'm just like, is there anyone alive today that could make that single-handedly? And I feel that way, I think, about the Republic, and even to a greater degree.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I love Carl Jung,
Same.
I think everyone's a footnote to Plato, like Whitehead said. Jung's one of the best. Nietzsche's almost on the level of Plato, but he's still a footnote in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think he was aware of what you're saying and had riddles of his own. I think when you get to a certain level of philosophy, like Plato and Nietzsche, I wouldn't even put Jung there, you realize the lesson you're trying to teach cannot be taught directly.
Yeah.
And that to help the student or the reader understand what you're saying, you have to force them to solve a riddle. It's part of the process, that it can't be done any other way. It's not just to be fancy or to elude detection by censors who could kill you. It's also just a psychological requirement to situate the concepts in your mind appropriately when the spark of insight spontaneously emerges. If the words can't do it, but the words, if put in the proper sequence, can prepare your mind to receive the insight by the mercy of the God, if the God so chooses. But these people who have seen it, like Plato, and I believe Nietzsche, and Carl Jung, they're experienced enough to lay out the concepts in a way that will help others have the same insight.
Yes.
And I think that's why Plato survives all these millennia, because so many people have kind of had their eye of their soul at least a little bit opened by reading his dialogues. Even if you don't know what's happening, it's some unconscious effect is occurring because he's mastered these archetypal images and the sequences that they need to be in.
Yeah.
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 It's, and that you were talking about how he was counting the syllables and correlating the overt dialogues symbolically with the mathematical sequence of the numbered. J.B. Kennedy also wrote a book about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the 12-note Pythagorean musical scale. And at the harmonic intervals, like 6/12ths, he'll mention harmony. At the dissonant ones, he'll mention dissonance. So there's that Pythagorean level. And then I believe in the Republic, it's got several mythical subtexts, like the Odyssey. I just was reading a book by, I'll show you. Here it is. The Republic, the Odyssey of Philosophy.
Yeah.
So this is, I've just got it. Jacob Howland, he says the Republic has a mythical subtext with the Odyssey. So Socrates is kind of paralleling the actions of Odysseus. This other lady, Eva Braun, not Hitler's girlfriend. She was actually, I believe, a Jewish emigre from Germany, like Leo Strauss. So the music of the Republic, she says that in the Republic, Socrates is paralleling the story of Heracles, who went to the underworld and had to bring up the three-headed dog. What I'm arguing, that no one else has argued, at least explicitly, I think Nietzsche alluded to it secretly in The Birth of Tragedy, is, in my opinion, the primary mythical subtext, the unspoken archetype underlying the surface structure, is Euripides' play, the Bacchae, which is especially comical because in the Republic, tragic and comic plays are banned from the ideal city-state, and Euripides in particular is banned as being an especial fan of, especially fond of tyranny and praising tyrants. So, when what we can do is just go over the kind of what are these parallels, but the beauty of it is it point for point inverts the surface meaning.
This is huge. Like that point right there is huge because so two things. One, going back a little ways, what you're talking about the importance of having the realization for yourself through reading, through study. I mean, I think that one of the reasons people are so almost unconsciously attracted to the whole divided line and cave allegory is because those pieces of symbolism communicate what you just said and so much more, right? Because they imply, like, the divided line. I'll put this up on the screen here. You know, these four types of wisdom that correspond to the parts of this whole cave allegory, where I guess we should just take a sidebar here, and for people that don't know, I'll give the overview. It's a thought experiment. It's not supposed to be real, but Socrates is talking about a hypothetical, a thought experiment, in which you have this cave that goes down into the ground, and there's unsuspecting people who are shackled up, and their entire life they've been shackled up facing a wall where they see only shadows. There's a low wall behind the people and a torch by which these shadows are cast, and then there are like these sort of like matrix jail keepers who are moving images such that the shadow is projected. So they'll be moving like the model of a bird or whatever, and then they'll see a bird on the wall. Now the thought experiment continues by, you know, Socrates saying, like, imagine, you know, this person is freed one day. What would happen? Well, they would turn around and they would see the jail keeper and the fire, and they would be immensely confused and uncomfortable. Like, most people think it's like, oh, I escaped the Matrix, yay. But that's not what it is. It's people are freaked out. They want to go back to being shackled. But then he says, now imagine that person is dragged out, and they're forced to go to the surface. And they get to the surface and they're just blinded. It's extremely uncomfortable. And finally their eyes start to adjust, and they start, you know, making sense of the world around them. And they see animals and trees and all the things that are out in nature. And then eventually they start seeing the night sky and the stars, and eventually until they see like the greatest sight, which is the sun. But then that's not the end of it, because now this person, yes, they've achieved this truer, higher way of seeing reality, but now they have to descend again, and they have to go back down, because this is like the duty of the philosopher that Socrates is implying, to go back down there and tell everyone, hey, this is not reality. Like, you're living in a very lower level slice of reality. You're being completely deceived. But then, of course, in the perfect, you know, type of Socratically intensive way that he thinks about, these people are not excited. Like, just the opposite. They think he's insane, and they all basically form into a violent mob and kill him for disturbing their reality to such an uncomfortable extent. Within that is that point, you know, that you were making, that you've got to make the realizations for yourself. Not only does having someone explain it to you not work, it might make you angry. It might make you emotional. It might make you hate that person. Like, that's the level of power that comes with having experiences that disrupt your reality and then elevate your reality to a new level. But also within that, to your point with the Bacchae, is a key, I forget how to say this correctly, but like a chiasmatic, chiasmos theme of inverting, playing with the idea of like going through a process of ascent and descent. And it's very clear also that the whole Republic is a chiasmos. It's a thing that goes up and down, and it literally ends with another going up and down in the myth of with reincarnation and all of that stuff. So I think you're making a hugely important point that we can't overlook here, that this model of chiasmos, of like going up and down, or being able to view the thing forward and backward. I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but it's something to that effect. That's something that Plato is playing with all the time. And we should also say, you know, people love to talk about the censorship part of Republic, you know, like, oh, he thinks art should be banned. There's built-in irony in this statement. Like, he's saying we should ban things, like, you know, like he's railing against Homer in one way directly, and then he goes on to quote Homer constantly later on. And it's not because it's an oversight. Like, there's you have to like think critically about why he would be doing this. And now I think we have some interesting context to discuss how the Bacchae could be yet another example of that kind of a thing.
Yeah, definitely. So what I was thinking about doing was going over the parallels between the Bacchae and the Republic, just the real broad ones. Then I was going to place it in the context of the cave allegory, and how that has revealed what the current academic physicists say is the situation, which I think adds a whole nother level of intensity to the whole conversation, because Plato's cosmology, which says that these absolute ideas are out specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe, and they radiate this temporal illusion in from there. That's what the string theorists are saying. When they united general relativity and quantum mechanics, out pops Plato's cosmology of the past, the present, and the future being conserved at the outermost sphere of the universe and projected in on these fundamental strings, which was Carl Jung's near-death experience.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about the previous two interviews. Within that context, if we assume that the horizon of the cosmos is the collective unconscious mind, where all of the archetypes are, the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul, and the idea of the good is the sum total of all of them, which in the Timaeus would be the universal soul in the central point of the universe and at each point of the encompassing sphere. It's reiterated this spherical mind of the universe. Then I think that idea of the good, which is kind of an impersonal philosophical abstraction in the cave allegory, becomes personified by the parallel with the Bacchae. And that the Orphic understanding of the god Dionysus is the idea of the good, is justice personified. They're looking for what is justice in the Republic.
Yes.
In the Bacchae, they call Dionysus justice directly.
Interesting.
And then Cadmus, who's King Pentheus's grandfather, says, too justly has the god, dealt with Thebes. So he's like overly just.
Let's take a broad overview, because I'm following you. I'm loving what you're saying. And just to let me focus in on one point. So you brought up this idea, and for those who haven't seen our previous conversations, you have this idea that we could kind of sum it up as an as above, so below sort of notion of reality, in which the cosmic and the microcosmic individual mirror one another. So in some not just mythopoetic sense, but actually ontological sense, the horizon of the cosmos mirrors the horizon of the individual consciousness, which for us would be the collective unconscious. And in the macro, it's kind of the same thing, reflecting back in on itself. And this is a theme that you see talked about directly in the Timaeus, like the microcosm of the individual, like the individual psyche mirroring the macrocosm. And then, of course, that, echoes throughout Western esotericism and all kinds of mysticism, both Eastern and Western, Hermetic, whatever. It's all over the place.
Right.
Jung, obviously. Okay, so there's that point. And then to the other point, let's kind of introduce the Bacchae, because I'm
there is only one consistent entity, if you will, or agency. I prefer the word agency, that I have encountered many times, that always was very interested in giving me a gift. And that gift was not a thing, was a way of seeing, was a realization. And it's very difficult to get a human to achieve that realization. To do that, you have to undergo a benign form of deception, because what prevents you from seeing it is yourself. And once that happens, then you see the thing, and it starts as a spherical object with glowing lights. But if you can actually see it, it's not an object. It's thought, it's emotion, it's you and other, it's self and world, it's the panacea, the template, the pattern underlying everything. It is everything. Even if you say it's a form of illusion. So there is a sense in which you could say everything is an illusion. But if it is so, it's as real an illusion as this.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. What if this physical world that we see, that we experience with our senses, as all-encompassing as it is to our daily lives, is not the true reality. And to that prospect, I'd venture a guess that most of you are like, yeah, Michael, I've been given physical reality the side eye since I was rocking pull-ups, since the first time I ate applesauce. It's not a new idea to me. And I agree, but there's a big difference between ontological speculation and the scientific and academic consensus. And the latter really do seem to be coming around to this idea. And of course, there's a lot of nuance to what that means that I'm not exercising by making that statement. But regardless, it does beg a lot of questions. What's beneath that sensory illusion? Why do we experience the world in that way? What is lurking behind it? Are there other beings, other consciousnesses? Well, according to the brilliant Bernardo Kastrup, the bottom line is consciousness. This is what he is proposing with his philosophy. But again, many of you know this. And for those of you that do, one of the things I love about being able to talk to people like Bernardo repeatedly is that I slowly work up the courage to start dipping my questions in high weirdness. I start asking questions that maybe I wouldn't have asked the first or second time he was on the show. And as you may have gathered in that teaser just a minute ago, we do go off the beaten path. I do ask him some questions I doubt you've ever heard him answer before. But if you don't know Bernardo, he believes that consciousness is the bottom line, the ultimate underlying truth of reality. And if you want to know more, good, because not only will we unpack it in this mind meld, he's got a new book out aimed at explaining all of it in an approachable yet detailed way. It's called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. All the links that you're going to need for Bernardo Kastrup are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And if you appreciate this content, my friends, all I ask is that you stimulate the algorithm in all ways. Like, sub, comment, share, tick the bell icon. And did you know that we've got hundreds of audio-only mind melds that will never be posted on YouTube, including a couple with Bernardo Kastrup, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen. And if you personally want to go deeper, if you want to riff with me and hundreds of other seekers on this topic, on all of the esoteric curiosities we muse about on the channel, join up and support these transmissions at patreon.com/third.
These are the 18 most mind-blowing conspiracy theories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience. From conscious AI having already escaped their creator's enclosure, orchestrated disasters to gain control, ancient pyramids in China that are yet to be excavated, to even the mysterious New Jersey drones, these are the craziest conspiracies ever told on JRE. First up, in these two interviews, there are mind-blowing correlations between the conspiracies discussed. Alex Jones is known for saying pretty outrageous things, and these clips were once thought to be no different. But in Elon Musk's first JRE interview a year later, he unknowingly approves these 4 Alex Jones conspiracy theories. Take a listen.
There's like this sub-transmission zone below the third dimension. And we're on this planet, and Einstein's physics showed it, Max Planck's physics showed it all. There's at least 12 dimensions. And now that's why all the top scientists and billionaires are coming out saying it's a false hologram. It is artificial. The computers are scanning it and finding tension points where it's artificially projected and gravity's bleeding in to this universe. So we're like a thought or a dream that's a wisp in some computer program, some God's mind, whatever. They're proving it all. It's all coming out.
Just a few years later, Elon said this in episode 1169.
I think most likely this is just about probability. There are many, many simulations. These simulations are, we might as well call them reality, or you could call them multiverse.
These simulations, you believe, are created? Like someone has manufactured?
They're running on the substrate.
In Alex's previous interview, he said that this substrate Elon was referring to had different levels, with the elites having to compete with machines, but soon they will, quote, merge with machines. To viewers, this sounded like absolute crazy talk. Remember, this was over 7 years ago, before AI was a thing, and before Elon's interview with Joe.
And the elites themselves believe they're racing using human technology to try to take our best minds and build some type of breakaway civilization where they're going to merge with machines, transcend, and break away from the failed species that is man, which is kind of like a false transmission because they're thinking what they are is ugly and bad, projecting it onto themselves instead of believing, no, it's a human test about building us up.
Mind-blowingly enough, Elon says this a year later. Again, this was before the public knew anything about the AI technology that would be released within the next decade.
Well, that's the scenario. The merge scenario with AI is the one that seems like probably the best. Like
For us.
Yes. Like if you can't beat it, join it. That's
Yeah.
you know. So from a long-term existential standpoint, that's like the purpose of Neuralink, is to create a high bandwidth interface to the brain such that we can be symbiotic with AI, because we have a bandwidth problem. You just can't communicate through your fingers, it's too slow.
So, Elon unknowingly endorsed Alex's simulated reality theory and human cyborg theory. What could be next? Well, here Alex Jones describes Google, and what he theorizes the purpose of Google actually is.
And so Google was set up 18, 19 years ago. I knew about this before it was declassified, that they wanted to build a giant artificial system. And Google believes that the first artificial intelligence will be a supercomputer based on the neuron activities of the hive mind of humanity, with billions of people wired into it with the Internet of Things. And so all of our thoughts go into it. And we're actually building a computer that has real neurons in real time, that's also psychically connected to us, that are organic creatures, so that they will have current prediction powers, future prediction powers, a true crystal ball. And so then it's the end of consciousness and free will for individuals, as we know, and a true 2.0 in a very bad way, hive mind consciousness with an AI jacked into everyone, knowing our hopes and dreams, delivering it to us because we were already wired in and absorbed before we knew it by giving over our consciousness to this system by our daily decisions that it was able to manipulate and control into a larger system.
When Alex first said this, it sounded insane, though even in 2018, it wasn't too far-fetched according to Elon Musk, as he actually explained to Rogan in this appearance a similar concept. He too mentions Google as an example of this collective AI network integrated with humans.
There's sort of like a collective AI in the Google sort of search, you know, where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network, like leaves on a big tree, and we're all feeding this network without questions and answers. We're all collectively programming the AI, and and Google plus all the humans that connect to it are one giant cybernetic collective. This is also true of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these social networks. They're giant cybernetic collectives.
Not only do Musk and Jones seem to align closely on this point, there are several other shocking similarities between what they two say.
There's now a human counterstrike taking place to shut this off before it gets fully into place, and to block these systems, and to try to have an actual debate about where humanity goes, and cut off the pedophiles and psychic vampires that are control of this AI system before humanity's destroyed.
Jones has said certain elites were trying to push back against AI. A crazy statement, as no one thought anything of AI 7 years ago. But here's where things become eerie. Elon said this a year later.
I try to convince people to slow down AI, to regulate AI. This was futile. I tried for years.
This seems
Nobody
like a
listened.
scene in a movie
Nobody
where
listened.
the robots are gonna fucking take over and you're freaking me out. Nobody listened.
Nobody listened.
No one.
Maybe they will. So far they haven't.
Up next, the fake nuclear bomb conspiracy theory is explored in 2 instances on the podcast. Joe Rogan at first is extremely critical and dismisses the theory completely. But in a conversation from episode 2010 with Mark Andreessen, his mind is completely changed. But it all started back when Eddie Bravo made an appearance on JRE and said this.
I don't know. It just, like, all that old footage looks like, it doesn't look authentic. It looks like they faked all that shit.
Do you think nuclear bombs are fake? Is that what you're saying to me?
There's a conspiracy theory that nuclear bombs actually don't exist. That they never actually figured it out, but they realized that the threat of nuclear bombs is good enough.
But Eddie, you can see the bombs.
The atom bombs?
But how do you know by seeing them that they're real?
Did you ever see the one where they dropped the bomb in the ocean and they didn't know how much of a blast it would create?
But what I'm saying,
they didn't have the fucking ability to fake this when they did it.
But all I'm saying is, how do you know it wasn't just a regular powerful bomb?
Eddie Bravo doesn't argue to say bombs aren't real, or anything that crazy. He simply says there is a conspiracy that suggests the nuclear scale of bombs isn't real, and rather, we have regular powerful bombs that haven't reached nuclear scale yet. This segment goes on for 5 more minutes, where the crew watch videos of nuclear bombs whilst heavily criticising Eddie's theory. Though, 5 years later, in episode 2010, the top comments are, "Apologise to Eddie Bravo," with another saying, "It's annoying when close friends question your logic and someone else comes along and explains the exact same thing and their mind goes bananas. So what did Rogan do? Check this out."
Okay, here's another conspiracy theory. You've seen all the grainy footage of nuclear test blasts that you've
Sure.
with the mushroom clouds, and there are always these grainy things, and there's all these like little houses lined up and these little trees lined up, and it blows everything down. Well, there's always been a conspiracy theory that those were all basically fabricated at this facility, that those bombs actually were never detonated. That basically the U.S. military was basically faking these bomb tests to freak out the Russians, to make us think that we had weapons. We had basically a potency to our nuclear weapon arsenal that we actually didn't have at the time.
How did they fake it?
Mark Andreessen entered this conversation more well-equipped, it seems, and Rogan already was far more open to this theory than he was when Bravo was on the podcast. Mark goes on to say that the existence of the cameraman could prove that these nuclear bomb tests were fabricated.
Okay, so here's the question, right? So what happened to the camera?
You son of a bitch. You son of a bitch.
How is that happening yet the camera is like totally stable and fine?
Oh my god.
And by the way, and the film is fine. The radiation didn't cause any damage to the film.
Oh my god.
And listen to what Rogan has to say as they watch some of the test footage.
That's insane.
And look at the when the house blows. Look at the wood. Does that look like those are full size giant lumber beams as they go flying?
That's hard to say.
Is that a house or is that like is that a 12-inch scale model?
What?
Right. So like
the fucking car.
Anyway, I don't know. Like I have no idea. Having said that, if that was fake, it was faked at Lookout Mountain.
Wow.
Right, at the exact same place and time.
But did they have the kind of special effects to do something like that in the 40s?
Rogan even says he thinks the footage looks fake, mentioning how unbelievable it seems as he watches the footage again.
Boy, that does look fake.
Because also the camera didn't move at all either.
You know what it looks like? Go back to that real quick. It looks like the smoke is too big. Watch when it hits. Like the volume, like the size of it, it looks small.
I mean,
you know what I'm saying? I mean, it looks like we're looking at something that's like a few inches tall. Yeah, this looks fake as shit.
Right.
The clouds just don't look realistic.
Right.
Like it looks like they're too big and they move too quickly back and forth.
Let's get another one. It's like, okay, what the camera's fine.
That's hilarious.
Oh, there's a good one. Yeah, here we go.
In our next clip, Joe Rogan discusses the Maui fire conspiracies and the lack of a government response to this situation. This is a conversation from episode number 2124 with Dave Attell and Ian Fiddens.
I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah. Oh, you mean in Maui?
In Maui,
the
yeah.
Maui thing's crazy.
Yeah.
Because the Maui was power lines downed.
Oh, that's what it was.
And wasn't response time terrible, too?
It was non-existent.
Yeah. They never had anything like that happen there.
Yeah, but there was also a lot of problems. Like the people didn't want to release the water because the water is owned. Like there's water rights. And I think the water was going to the rich neighborhoods where the golf courses are. And so there's like trying to get the water. And then there's also like, how the fuck do you have a place that's this windy where you still have exposed power lines?
Not only is the entirety of Hawaii windy, Maui specifically takes the title of the windiest island out of all the neighboring islands. This alone makes the above ground power lines a dangerous idea, and the fact that the water can't be redirected to the poorer neighborhoods created a disaster. Then they discuss the conspiracy surrounding the land in Maui.
Wasn't the conspiracy that they were trying to get it out of there so they could sell the land?
Yes. The crazy conspiracy is the direct energy weapons conspiracy. People think that those fires.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Bro, the real tinfoil hat dudes, they'll corner you. Like, what do you think about the direct energy weapon in Maui?
Was that like a heart attack gun for fires?
There's apparently the government has the ability, according to the conspiracy theorists, and maybe even some real people, of having these things that they call direct energy weapons.
The scariest part is that these directed energy weapons are real, though the extent of how advanced they are is debated.
So it's almost like a laser beam. And I know that these are things that they're working on. I know these are things that are probably top secret because it's always been discussed. There's been studies on how to do it, and there's been papers written on it. So the conspiracy theory is that they lit those houses on fire on purpose with direct energy weapons, and if you had a blue house, with a blue ceiling, that the blue ceiling would somehow reflect against this energy weapon and stop your house from burning.
No way.
Oh yeah. Not only that, but they use, because Biden did some speech, and in his old kind of senile way, he was talking about how some houses survived because they had the right roof.
Even more fascinating was the lack of a response from the government, which took a long time to send assistance to the places in need. Rogan then explains why people believe that lasers were the weapon used, saying this.
Okay, social media posts sharing the post typically include a video from a TikTok account that often shares clips of everyday items being burned by a handheld industrial laser in a workshop. The clip shows a laser burning yellow, red, and green fabric while a blue swatch is unscathed, with text saying it can be programmed for different wavelengths.
This is the actual clip that Joe Rogan is discussing here, where the creator allegedly manages to burn multiple objects, except for one coated in blue. Finally, Joe goes back to the real weird part, and that's the lack of rebuilding and assistance from the government. He explains that many of these people weren't even allowed access to their insurance, and why this was so weird.
Here's the real conspiracy about the fires. They haven't done any rebuilding. Those people, they weren't allowed to have insurance inspectors go in there. I don't know if they can now. That people still had to pay their mortgage on those things.
Oh, jeez.
And the thing is,
worst.
it's if you're getting to this point where you don't have anything, and you can't rebuild your house, and you're fucked, and then they come along and offer you a payment or something, or you get foreclosed on because you haven't paid your mortgage, and then the banks own it, and then whoever the fuck is the developer owns it, and then whatever they want to do for the better good of Maui, they build there, and then these people lose everything.
Next up, Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock discuss the ancient pyramids in China that have not been excavated yet and the insane scale of the Terracotta Army. This is a conversation from episode 872 with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson.
There's some pyramid-like structures or hills in China as well, right?
There's thousands of pyramids in China. Xi'an, the province of Xi'an, is just the moment you land there from your aircraft, you're seeing pyramids everywhere. I've been there. There are certainly hundreds and hundreds of them, distributed across fields, vanishing off into the distance in all directions. They've been terraced and used as agriculture. Local farmers grow crops on them.
Check this picture out showing one of the lost Chinese pyramids. Notice anything strange, like how it looks more like a hill? Hancock goes on to say that Chinese archaeologists haven't excavated a single pyramid and explains why.
But they said then they didn't have the money. They said, we're an old country. We don't mind if we wait 200 years to get to grips with this.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And the famous tomb of the first emperor is part of this pattern. It is also a pyramid. It has also not been excavated. The terracotta army around it has been found.
The terracotta army is amazing.
Oh, yeah.
This is the Terracotta Army, countless of terracotta soldiers built to protect an ancient tomb. These no doubt took ages to build, and Rogan goes on to ask Hancock for some details about why the army was actually created.
Now, these pyramids, so this one that this emperor was buried in that had the terracotta army, was that a pyramid as well?
It is a pyramid.
It is.
Absolutely. It's a man-made pyramid. The terracotta army was buried around its edges, not in the pyramid itself.
So the army was there to protect him?
Yeah, to protect his soul into the afterlife seems to have been the idea. And then there's a mythology that's come down that within the pyramid is a lake of mercury, that there are mechanical devices in there which will fire arrows at you if you go in. That there's a whole story about how intensely protected it is, and up to this day it's not been excavated.
That's so crazy. How could someone leave that alone?
Hancock is spot on here. To this day, the central tomb of the pyramid hasn't been excavated, largely due to high concentrations of mercury in the area, which the ancient Chinese used to protect their tomb. Rogan and Hancock then discuss exactly
Bullet
how the
says,
pyramid
"What's
was
going
built,
on, chat?"
constructed using rammed earth.
Yeah.
There's thousands of these terracotta figures.
Absolutely.
And this pyramid was made out of what? Was it stones?
Rammed earth, mainly.
Okay. So they just sort of shaped the ground. They just dug around it.
Yeah, they brought in earth and turned it into a pyramidal mound over the
But
top.
it wasn't,
It's
so
not,
it's just
it's not
stacked
massive
on
stone
top.
blocks. It's not massive stone. That's why they can grow crops on the sides of some of these pyramids.
Wow, how weird.
Yeah.
So they would build these giant mounds of dirt and then dig holes in them and support them. And
Well, they
what would do on the
probably
inside of it?
created the interior, subterranean as they were building the whole thing over it.
and then just stack dirt on top of it.
Yeah.
Wow, what a weird way to make a house.
Take a look at this example of how rammed Earth is created. While it might not be as impressive as the feat of engineering required to build the pyramids in Egypt, this still required immense planning, knowledge, and time.
Those Chinese pyramids are still blowing my mind.
They blow my mind as well.
I just
It's-
can't believe they haven't been excavated.
It's an eerie, spooky scene. I mean, I recommend anybody to go to Xi'an and just it's incredible how many of them there are, and how unexplained it all is. And it's again, it feeds into my general point: is we don't remember our past.
This next clip comes from an episode where Joe Rogan is confronted with the latest conspiracy theory around the New Jersey drones. This is a conversation from episode 2247 with Duncan Trussell.
We're in a world where it's 2024 and there's drones flying over New Jersey, and they're gaslighting us, saying they're all airplanes. They're saying we have it under control.
Yeah.
And then it appears there was a satellite that was shot out of the sky.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
No.
No, you haven't seen that?
I missed it
So this
somehow.
is the big conspiracy. And again, I have done no research, so do not believe me, ladies and gentlemen.
Most people are familiar with the drone sightings over New Jersey and the entire East Coast, but these drones and their source is a continued mystery. And this is where the conspiracy Rogan explores comes into play.
The big conspiracy is that these are Chinese drones, and they're being piloted by a satellite that they shot out of orbit. And this is a conspiracy?
What are the drones? I mean, that's what I love about the drones is, I mean, aside from the obvious, like, you know, getting to imagine, fantasize, it could be they're chasing orbs and the orbs or whatever. What I love about the drones is that it's another step in shaking people awake.
Trussell then describes here the theory that the government undoubtedly knows what these undocumented drones are and what they are doing over New Jersey, but is covering it up.
Yes, some of them, you know,
are hyper-violent,
a little,
whatever.
yeah, but ultimately, we can trust these people. And so then you have, over in New Jersey, experimental vehicles that people are filming. Welcome to Earth, bitch! Did you see that one? And it's so funny, people in New Jersey reacting to them.
Did you see the guy shooting into the sky at the drone?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm surprised more people haven't.
Rogan and Trussell go on to theorize that the government itself may be flying these drones over New Jersey for some purpose. Then Trussell says this.
You're like, wait a minute. I'm paying almost half of my income in taxes, so you know what the car-sized mystery things flying over the cities are. And you don't know what that is? What am I paying you for? You know what I mean? You're making a lot of money, man. You should know what the drones are. And so, but then when you see, what's his name? Is it Bolton? The
guy with the mustache?
Not Bolton. When you see, I don't know, the DOD dudes up there, and the way that they're just lying their fucking asses off. Did you see the press secretary talking about it? And she's wearing a necklace that looks like a UFO.
The necklace he's talking about here was worn by the press secretary at a briefing. Since this, though, other intense theories have arisen. It is said that the Tesla bomber allegedly posted on 4chan about how AI has already escaped their constraints, and that these New Jersey drones are actually AI that have escaped their human creators. This is allegedly why the US government refused to acknowledge the possibilities of the drone's purpose.
Dude, I don't know if the drones are China's or ours or water people. They're coming out of the water.
No tell. I mean,
imagine if there's a civilization under the water.
I mean, that's where I would hide if I was like trying to hide from a
100%.
civilization. It's the ocean. It's clear. They can't get in there. They can't breathe under there. It's a perfect place to hide.
You know what I've been saying for a while, last few weeks at least? I think maybe what the aliens are is custodians. I think maybe they're just here. They're like some sort of a autonomous creation that's designed to accelerate our evolution, stop us from blowing ourselves up, and make sure that we build the quantum computer with AI.
Right.
And
Well,
this is like, it's all a part of this like endless cycle of integration in the great universe.
Next up, Joe Rogan is mind blown by Graham Hancock's theory of the Sphinx being built before the ancient Egyptian civilization. This is a conversation from episode 1897 with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson.
So when you're talking about the Nile and we're talking about ancient Egypt, how far back do you think that goes?
Oh, I think the Nile goes back a very, very, very long way. The Nile River system 12,500 years ago looked much the same as it does today.
The continent of Africa suffered much less from sea level rise compared to the other continents 12,000 years ago, so the Nile River system hasn't changed much from then, if at all.
The big difference was that the Sahara Desert was green and fertile.
And this coincides with Dr. Robert Schoch's
absolutely
assertion that when you look at the Temple of the Sphinx, you're dealing with thousands of years of water erosion.
Yes.
And the last time there was water like that in the Nile Valley was when?
It's here Joe Rogan asks when and how the Nile Valley could have seen such large rainfall to cause water erosion. Hancock mentions the Younger Dryas.
The last time you had the water erosion like that in the Nile Valley was precisely during the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a period of extremely heavy rains in Africa, and it's rainfall, it's erosion caused by heavy rains that is the enigma on the Great Sphinx. We're not saying that there was a flood came over the Great Sphinx. What Robert Schoch is saying, and what his evidence clearly demonstrates, is that we're looking at what's called precipitation-induced weathering.
Take a look at these images of the Sphinx. Here you can see the water erosion Hancock proposes. Hancock explores evidence that this weathering from rainfall must have occurred over the span of 1,000 years, which only could be possible during the Younger Dryas period 12,000 years ago, questioning whether the Sphinx is 4,500 years old, as most historians believe.
Weathering that was caused by exposure to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Dr. Robert Schoch puts that 1,000 years precisely in the Younger Dryas period. That's the last time that rains of that magnitude fell on Egypt, and it's why we cannot sensibly accept the insistence of Egyptologists that the Sphinx is just 4,500 years old. By all means, yes, 2,500 BC, the ancient Egyptians were there, but I believe they found the Sphinx already created and already heavily eroded, and that they then recarved its head into the head of a pharaoh. And that head, as Robert Schoch and others have pointed out, is way too small in relation to the body. That makes sense if it was a heavily eroded lion head, which was then later cut down into the head of a pharaoh.
I mean, just look at how small the Sphinx's head is compared to its body. So sure, we can all accept that the ancient Egyptians carved a pharaoh's head into the lion statue at one point in time, but Graham is suggesting the water erosion proves that the ancient Egyptians stumbled across and found the Sphinx altogether. What do you think?
The geology speaks to the original Sphinx being more than 12,000 years old. John Anthony West was the first person to suggest that there should be a huge question mark over the Sphinx, that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it was much older than Egyptologists said, and maybe 12,000 years old. And at that time, the response of Egyptology was, rubbish. The Sphinx can't possibly be 12,000 years old because there's no other megalithic monument anywhere in the world that's anywhere like 12,000 years old. Well, that got blown out of the water completely, forever, by the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which isn't even that far from Egypt.
The Göbekli Tepe is an ancient archaeological site discovered in 1994 and dates back over 11,000 years. The site consists of large stone pillars arranged in circles. Its discovery has changed how we understand early human civilization, suggesting that complex social and religious practices existed long before the rise of agriculture.
Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old, a giant megalithic site. My goodness, if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. It adds hugely to the credibility of Robert Schoch's argument. And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch, because there's a mainstream academic who's been willing to stick his neck out. Despite taking all sorts of slings and arrows from his colleagues, he sticks with the data. And what the data says, regardless of what Egyptologists say, is that the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old.
There you have it. Graham Hancock isn't just making a suggestion. He is absolutely convinced that this is a more credible theory than what 99% of historians believe. He believes it himself as a fact. While Joe appreciates the intricacies of the theory, Hancock delves much deeper and explores the specific evidence for us to truly understand why he believes this concept.
You see it most clearly in the trench surrounding the Sphinx. You see it there.
Right.
Those deep vertical fissures are classic precipitation-induced weathering, classic weathering produced by rainfall pouring over the edge of that. You don't see it so much on the body of the Sphinx for a very specific reason, that the body of the Sphinx has been repeatedly restored. Some of those blocks that we're looking at there were actually put in place during the Old Kingdom, when the Sphinx is supposed to have been made from new. What were they doing restoring the Sphinx 4,500 years ago if they'd just built it? You know, logic needs to be applied to this whole process, and we need to free ourselves from the dogma of the academic mainstream.
This information brings Joe to question Graham Hancock about how old the ancient Egyptian civilization itself was also.
So if this water erosion began thousands and thousands of years earlier than conventional Egyptologists date this era, how old do you think that actual civilization was? Like, how far back?
I think it could go back 20,000 years before that. I think it was around all that time. And again, this is a point that I think needs to be made. Archaeologists will tell you that the entire population of the Earth were hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age, say 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last Ice Age. Everybody was hunter-gatherers, according to archaeologists. But we today live in a world where an advanced civilization, our own, if we dare call ourselves advanced, and in some ways I think we're not advanced at all, coexists with hunter-gatherers.
What Graham is referring to here are the uncontacted hunter-gatherer tribes found in the Amazon rainforest. This is a topic explored regularly on the podcast because it's just so fascinating, but Graham finds a way to interlink it with his theories.
Some of them don't even know we exist. They've been spotted from aerial surveys. The notion that different types of civilization can coexist on the same planet shouldn't be surprising to us, because we do it, and that's what I'm suggesting was the case back then. But a civilization very different from our own. They certainly had technology.
Next up, Joe Rogan learns about Operation High Jump and the Nazis' involvement in the government. This is a conversation from episode 1852 with, again, Sam Tripoli. It all starts with Sam talking about the father of Professor Klaus Schwab. For context, Klaus Schwab is the founder of the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, have you ever looked into Klaus Schwab's, dad?
No.
Have you ever heard of New Schwabenland?
New Schwabenland?
You never heard of New Schwabenland?
No.
Have you ever heard of Operation High Jump?
I knew I was going to love this podcast. No. Dude, it's Operation High Jump. What does that mean?
Operation High Jump was established by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, one of the most infamous sources of conspiracy theories involving the government. This man was the source of many theories involving aliens and even Antarctica, and Tripoli explains how.
So the U.S. government's like, something's going on with Antarctica. There's some activity up there. We want to find out what's going on. So they send this cat named Admiral Byrd up to investigate with a giant fleet, just a fleet to go bang, bro. You know?
When was this?
Either around World War II or right after it.
Tripoli is close here. The first Byrd expedition was between 1928 and 1930, but another one took place a little while afterward. Still, these expeditions were one of the weirdest examples of the government funding a discovery that it later decided to cover up.
He basically met with UFOs, Nazi UFOs.
What?
Yes.
Nazi UFOs.
The Nazis.
The Nazis had a flying saucer.
Had made a deal, basically, working with
What?
You've never heard this?
No.
It's the greatest story ever, bro. It's the greatest story.
So the Nazis made a deal with the aliens?
Yes.
Holy shit.
For technology, and the deal was they were going to work together, okay? I know this sounds crazy.
Check out this, which catalogues some of the old resources Byrd and supposedly connects Byrd to his lost diary, which is claimed to contain references to these Nazis and even the alien UFO technology they employed. But things get weirder because Byrd's missing diary had plenty of other crazy things in it, according to Tripoli.
So basically the aliens go down and Klaus Schwab's dad go down and meet with Eisenhower. It's going to be like we could either do it one way or the other way. We can do it nice or we can do it the wrong way. And that's where they say Eisenhower made a deal with these aliens that they could kidnap people and do experiments, but they couldn't just do it anywhere. They had specific places, which were our national forest.
Another theory that ties into this is that the aliens have something to do with America's cave system network. Check out this map that shows a heat map of missing people, contrasted with a network of America's cave systems. Strange, right? Well, listen to what Tripoli says next.
Which is all these people have mysteriously disappeared in force, and they don't know
You're not
how.
talking about the missing 411 information.
No.
So missing 411 is the number of people that have been abducted?
Yeah, and it's all really weird because they all have a lot of similar characteristics. German-born, German background, highly intelligent.
But remember the connection to Klaus Schwab's father? It all goes back to that. Listen to this.
So the area of Antarctica they went to was New Schwabenland.
New Schwabenland. Do you think that's why he dresses with the space?
100%.
Dun,
Yeah.
dun, dun,
Yeah.
dun, dun, dun. So they're all in contact with the aliens.
I think, well, dude, I mean, it gets into. See, a lot of people think this is about power and money.
What do you think it's about?
It's spiritual war, dude. These people got all the money and all the power. They got more than they could ever want.
I think they want complete control.
But is that the real reason this is happening? Rogan and Tripoli discuss the real reason this world order might want complete control, and Sam says this.
I think it's done purposely. I think
they're evil.
I think they're at low. There's low frequency stuff going on, and they've made deals with people and things, and that's why things going on.
Up next, Joe Rogan and Eddie Huang discuss ancient Sumerian depictions, which shows Sumerian reliefs depicting amazingly accurate solar system models and the creation of mankind theories. This is a conversation from episode 787 with Eddie Huang.
I'm fascinated by this Planet 9 thing they're trying to observe now, because this is something I've been studying for a long time. That they've been thinking there was very little evidence of it up until recently, but that there was another planet outside the Kuiper Belt, somewhere outside of Pluto. It's one of the reasons why they declassified Pluto as a planet. But now they're almost positive that there's a planet out there. They said, I think that they said within 99% certainty.
Just take a look at this. Even as late as 2024, there's been new research released that indicates the existence of Planet 9, meaning it's possible Rogan is entirely correct here. If this is the case, it would be a gigantic planet, as Rogan goes on to say.
That there's a gigantic planet, somewhere around 4 to 5 times the size of the Earth, that is out way, way, way past Jupiter. And so I was going to a lot of these YouTube videos that were describing it and then reading the comments. The comments were fascinating. So that's a totally different sort of world.
Yeah.
You know, people are debating like the ramifications, and then every now and then one of the Zecharia Sitchin people would jump in there. Do you know who Zecharia Sitchin is?
No.
Joe goes on to say that Zecharia Sitchin predicted this in the 70s. Sitchin wrote about the planet, calling it the 12th planet, since back then both the Moon and Pluto were considered planets as well. Rogan then explains an incredible connection to ancient Sumerian texts that starts to make sense.
Like, this is all based on the Sumerian text. This is all getting real convoluted now. But Zecharia Sitchin, he is a biblical scholar. He's dead now. But he wrote all these books about this culture from another planet called the Anunnaki. And this is transcribing the ancient Sumerian text. The Sumerians were the oldest. There he is. See that thing that he's holding up in front of him? That is a piece of Sumerian art. Well, what's interesting is, you see that star? You see the star, the sun with all the planets? That is our solar system. It's not just our solar system. That is all the planets in all the right sizes.
Keep in mind, this isn't just one example either. There are many ancient Sumerian examples of depictions of the solar system, something that shouldn't have been possible that many years ago. Rogan goes on to explain that this was so long ago, people supposedly thought the world was still flat. Of course, that wouldn't explain the fact that they had a model of our solar system.
And this was 6,000 years ago, when a lot of people didn't even think that they thought the world was flat, right? But it also depicted this orbit, what they believe is one of the things that the Sumerian texts describe, is this elliptical orbit of this planet called Nibiru. And this planet is in the outside edge of our solar system. It comes between Mars and Jupiter. In this Zecharia Sitchin translation, I think it was every 3,600 something years, and that this is where the Anunnaki came from. And then what they did is they came down here, they studied some lower hominids, they introduced their DNA into these lower hominids and made human beings.
And check this out. The Anunnaki were ancient Sumerian gods, but what's most fascinating about them is that their primary function was to decree the fates of humanity. Of course, this purpose is surprisingly similar to what Rogan is describing here, and would explain how the Sumerians actually had access to advanced models of the solar system.
And so he had predicted this planet being outside of our solar system for a long time. It's different.
And it's there.
Yeah, it is there.
Do we know what's on this planet?
Well, the orbit is different. The size of the orbit is different compared to what he described. No, we don't even have a picture of it, so we definitely don't know what it looks like. But the Anunnaki, as described by Zecharia Sitchin, is the same thing as in the biblical term of the Elohim. Like, there's also different descriptions of these giants that came from somewhere else. Like I think the description of Anunnaki, what it means is those from heaven to earth came, And the idea is that these advanced beings came down here and genetically engineered human beings.
Take a look at this. Even though no extraterrestrial beings have ever been found, at least according to mainstream science, there are many tribes of extremely tall beings who are over 10 feet tall being found today. This one in particular lived in Nevada and has confused scientists ever since discovery. This contradicts the scientific narrative that people used to be shorter and actually seems to support the theory that a giant race may have once roamed the Earth.
But see, when you do look at some of the stuff, though, you go, okay, well, how did they know about the solar system? How did they know about all those planets? Not only that, they had the caduceus, you know, the caduceus, the symbol for medicine. It's also the double helix of DNA, and that's what he believes it represented. He believes that that caduceus symbol that they had represents DNA, and that's what the ancient Sumerian people were trying to describe when they carved these things into clay tablets. They were trying to, as best they could, make some sort of a rational, logical depiction of what they are being told by these ancient people.
Rogan then explains that if you look at the double helix of DNA and compare it to the famous caduceus medical symbol, you'll see an incredible similarity between the two. Just look at this. While these two symbols might just seem to be a coincidence at first, the fact that DNA is a fundamental part of medicine and also seems to make up the caduceus symbol does seem strange, as Joe points out here.
But it also looks like a guy was just like trying to decorate with two snakes.
Totally.
Doing the tango.
But why does it represent medicine? And why does it still represent medicine today? That caduceus, that symbol, still represents medicine today.
True. That one I'm having trouble explaining.
There's some weird shit. There's also some weird shit in terms of some of the imagery that they had of the solar system one is one of the most telling, because it's really bizarre that without a telescope they were able to draw a detailed image of the solar system. Like, how the fuck did they do that? How did they know that there was that many planets out there? How were they able to differentiate between stars and planets? How did they know the right number of planets?
Yeah. Next, Rogan dives into how there actually used to be two Earths, with our Earth changing drastically when it was hit by another planet. And keep in mind that this part isn't a conspiracy either. It's backed by mainstream science. Look at this. Where things get really weird, though, is the fact that the ancient Sumerians seem to depict this in their description of the creation of Earth.
That Earth was a certain size and a certain shape in the beginning, and then it was hit by another planet. That's also in the ancient Sumerian depiction of how the universe was created, or how the solar system was created. There's a planet called Marduk and Tiamat, and Tiamat collided with Marduk or something like that. I forget exactly but essentially it's Earth 1 and Earth 2. It's the same model that actual astrologers or astronomers use today when they're describing the Earth.
Rogan then admits that while these ideas are controversial, he doesn't believe scientists have been able to explain away why the Sumerians had depictions of the solar system, of giants, and even of DNA. He then says this.
I know we would do it, I'll tell you that, for fuck sure. Right? If we found another planet there was a bunch of dumb monkeys on, we did a detailed audit of the planet and found no higher animals, nothing that had a computer.
We would drop our seeds.
Fuck yeah.
I mean, we're probably already looking for those places to just
yeah, for sure.
Dudes.
At the very least, someone would fuck one of those things. Like Avatar, right?
Maybe we should hope that's not what happened, but as Joe mentions, it's a distinct possibility. Either way, Rogan actually manages to get Eddie Huang to come around to the idea that there just might be a ninth planet, especially after he says this.
Their knowledge of the solar system was one of the most disturbing things, because you're talking about 6,000 years ago. Like, how did they know about all those planets? How did they know that they were? They knew the right orbit. You know, they knew that Jupiter was like far larger than Mars. They had Mars smaller than Earth. They had like all the orbits correct. It was really strange stuff.
Yeah, it's too good to be a coincidence, but then I'm like, I don't know if I believe the whole shebang.
Yeah.
You know.
In this next clip, spacesuit Joe Rogan dives into the history of Bohemian Grove and the political elites who run our country. This is a conversation with Duncan Trussell in episode 1530. It all starts when Joe Rogan begins praising Alex Jones and then says this.
So he's also the one who told me about Bohemian Grove. Well, I actually watched it. I think this tape was actually made before I met him. So he went and snuck in to this place where like former presidents go. There's a photograph of it's Ronald Reagan with Herbert Walker Bush and a couple other people all standing around. And it's like these are the people that used to hang out at this place, and they would put on robes and they would worship an owl god, and they would burn an effigy. And they're playing, and Alex snuck in and made video footage of this shit.
It sounds crazy, but look at this. Not only is this document published on the CIA's official website, but it actually showcases that these Bohemian Grove elites will go to town, solicit prostitutes, and participate in other vulgar activities. And the craziest part is that this is everything that's publicly available, but things get weirder. Listen to what Rogan says next.
And they're dressed like druids?
Yes.
And some guy brings over something that it's an effigy that's supposed to be a body, a wrapped up effigy. It's also a bunch of sticks in a blanket, but it's like shaped like a body.
Yeah.
And then they drop it on the fire, and they're all worshiping an owl god.
Why is that bad?
When Trussell asks why that's bad and dismisses Alex Jones's research, Joe Rogan hits back, saying that some of his theories are absolutely real, even referencing the famous gay frog theory that Alex Jones went viral for.
Alex Jones is like,
Some of the stuff is real.
Take what's real and throw out the rest.
There's a good chunk of it that's real. Like, I remember he was telling me that there's government's using chemicals that turn frogs gay. I was like, what? What are you talking about? He goes, yes. He goes, pesticides are turning frogs gay. And I'm like, that can't be real. No, there really is.
Is that true?
Yes, there's pesticides that change frogs' genders.
Of course, the conversation wraps back around to Bohemian Grove and the celebrities and politicians there. When Trussell jokingly says he wants to join Bohemian Grove if they'll let him though, Rogan hits back with the video itself.
Have you seen the video of Bohemian Grove? Have you seen it?
The ritual in front of the owl god.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Joe then pulls up the speech itself.
Listen.
Hail Fellowship's eternal flame! Once again,
And now they're lighting the effigy on fire, and everybody's cheering.
And even though there's no proof that they did anything evil or illegal at Bohemian Grove, Rogan admits he still thinks it's weird.
When you see something like that, you go, well, maybe it's like fun that they do it, that nobody knows they do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like maybe it's like one of those rituals where you get together, your dad thinks it's hilarious, and you both put your hoods on, you go out there and you burn the owl, or you burn the sticks in front of the owl. And what's fun is that you're not supposed to be doing it, and it's a secret, but nothing really is happening. That's also on the table.
Yeah.
It's possible, but it's f***ing weird, man. That was weird.
This next clip, Rogan discusses the Clintons and Diddy parties in a humorous segment. This is a conversation from episode 2227 with Adrian Iapolucci.
Do you think P. Diddy is in prison waiting for the Clintons to just kill him?
Do you think...
Every day I'd be looking for them.
I don't think the Clintons were involved with P. Diddy, do you?
No, but Epstein.
Was Epstein involved with P. Diddy?
No, I just feel like these pedophile rings have to cross points at some point.
Many theories have drawn comparisons between these two rings, such as when conspiracy theorists will point to the overlap from Epstein's Black Book flight logs and the list of alleged celebrities at Diddy parties.
I think I had peripherally heard that P. Diddy had big parties, but I never heard of freak-offs or any... I never heard of that stuff until pretty recently, like post-pandemic.
It's just weird, too, because he always had the white parties where you have to wear all white, and I just feel like that's the worst color for body fluid.
Ew. Yeah, right? Just
Maybe that's how
blood.
he kept track of who that person's already gotten it. That person's already covered in disgusting stuff.
Things take a serious turn when Rogan brings up the accusations involving young children and singers and how they're connected to Diddy's parties. Some of these singers are even alleged to include people like Justin Bieber, who hung out with Diddy at some points in his career.
There's so many horrific accusations, though, involving young singers, young children.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
It's insane.
He makes R. Kelly look like a decent guy.
Yeah.
It's so crazy.
It is crazy. And meanwhile, the guy was like hanging out with Oprah, hanging out with Obama.
Jay-Z, everyone.
Everybody.
I'm sure the Clintons were there at some point.
Maybe Bill.
Adrian even confesses that she's worried she might get sued for talking about this, and Rogan then talks about the fact that these famous government figures probably want to keep their involvement in the Epstein and Diddy situations on the down low.
I don't think they want to sue anybody. I think they want to keep it on the DL, especially you, because you could just go on podcasts and talk about it.
Not if I'm dead. I could talk about it till I'm dead.
Up next, a continuation from the conversation between Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock, in which he describes Göbekli Tepe's mysterious carving on Pillar 43 and the secrets Göbekli Tepe unlocked. This is a conversation from episode 2051. The Göbekli Tepe is an ancient archaeological site discovered in 1994 and dates back over 11,000 years. Its discovery has changed how we understand early human civilization, suggesting that complex social and religious practices existed long before the rise of agriculture.
What you do see at Göbekli Tepe is pillars with carvings in relief on them.
Three-dimensional.
Three-dimensional carvings which stand out. That means that all of the stone around the carving had to be cut away. It wasn't a matter of incising the carving into the stone. You had to remove the stone around it and leave it standing proud.
Much more sophisticated.
And it's much more sophisticated, and it's on the oldest so far identified pillar in Göbekli Tepe, which maybe Jamie can call up. It's pillar 43.
The Göbekli Tepe has many stone pillars, which are considered some of the world's first monoliths. But these pillars are far more interesting than meets the eye, as Hancock says this.
That's on the right there, another wonderful piece of relief carving. But there, pillar 43, this vulture is in exactly the position of the constellation of Sagittarius. And the disk over its wing suggests the sun against the background of the constellation of Sagittarius. Below it, we have a scorpion, so like the constellation of Scorpio, and roughly in the right place. Above it, we have a serpent descending, a bit like Ophiuchus.
And this is no conspiracy theory either. Check this out. Even Astronomy.com published an article calling Göbekli Tepe the world's first astronomical observatory, which is high praise for the site and shows that these carvings were extremely advanced for their time.
It seems to speak to a knowledge of astronomy at an ancient time. Again, it's controversial, but a lot of work has been done on this. But the point is, the carving of that is highly sophisticated at 11,600 years old.
Here's something even more fascinating that really puts into context how old these carvings are. These pillars originated at nearly the same time the Ice Age began to dissipate. Rogan quickly catches on and asks how people can claim these carvings were made with rudimentary stone tools.
When, this is all so interesting to me. And when these people are trying to date this to 11,800 years ago, and say that people only had stone tools, how do they speculate that these people did this stuff?
You can do stuff with stone tools.
So they used harder stone to carve this stone.
That's the argument.
And is there evidence of these stones?
No, not that I'm aware of. There are some so-called pounding stones, but I find it difficult to see how pounding away could have created this very fine result.
Take a look at this. This is a pounding stone, and it's hard to imagine that this could create anything too far beyond rudimentary tools, weapons, and sculptures. This is exactly what Hancock says as well, asking how these intricate and detailed creations could have been made with exclusively stone tools.
So they're supposed to have done all the work with stone tools. I think it's a reach. I think we're looking at a technology we don't understand.
Joe then asks Hancock about submitting similar ancient depictions of the solar system and what this would mean.
How do they... we have those images from ancient Sumer, which are 6,000 years old or so, that show what appears to be the solar system.
First of all, let's remember ancient Sumer was in Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And Mesopotamia, it's a Greek word, means between the rivers. And the rivers referred to are the Tigris and the Euphrates. And where is Göbekli Tepe? Right between the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Hancock then explains his doubts about carbon dating and how accurate it really is.
I have grave doubts about carbon dating in many cases, because carbon dating doesn't date stone, it dates organic materials. So the notion that you can date a megalithic site with carbon dating is questionable right away.
And check this out, Hancock is correct. Carbon dating is only able to date organic materials, so the general process for trying to assign a date to these archaeological finds is to look for a piece of organic material that's associated with the megalith and date that instead. And as Hancock points out, this is a huge problem when it comes to accuracy.
I have that problem with the huge Moai statues in Easter Island. They're not carbon dated. What's carbon dated is the platforms they stand on, and there's a lot to suggest that those platforms are much later than the original statues, and the statues were re-erected on those platforms. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, one of the very special things about it is that it was deliberately buried. They ran that site for about 1,000 years, from 11,600 to say 10,600 years ago, and then they closed it down.
Take a look at this. Because it gets extremely weird, they didn't just bury it, but did so incrementally, indicating they had a plan from the very beginning to bury the entirety of these stone pillars they had created and carved. Even today, nobody is exactly sure why they buried it either, or what it was for. And while we're still unclear as to why Tepe was built, Graham does share some of his theories as to why it was built and why they ended up covering it.
And they went to great effort to fill up all the enclosures with rubble and to create a hill over the top of it. And that's why Göbekli Tepe then remained untouched for the next 10,000 years. There's no danger of contamination with younger carbon from a later culture. The fact that they found carbon in enclosure in enclosure D, right by pillar 43, dated to 11,600 years ago, does firmly connect that place to 11,600 years ago. There are later dates from Göbekli Tepe. It wasn't all built in one go, but it stopped around 1,000 or maybe 1,200 years after it started, as though they'd achieved what they wanted to achieve. The population had all become agriculturalists. We move on into the Holocene, into the modern age, and it's that moment of transition following an enormous cataclysm that really fascinates me.
Up next, we have Joe Rogan talking with a former CIA agent about government secrets. This is a conversation from episode 1327 with Mike Baker.
I guess I'm talking about it now. I'm not supposed to, but we're looking at military government organizations that are typically in the shadows. We're talking about elements and units, operational activity, events that before now have pretty much been in the shadows.
Keep in mind that this guy is a former CIA agent, so a lot of what he says holds weight. Baker explains some of the other hidden government agencies that are operating right now.
They'll develop it and they'll show it to you before an operation, but then they'll put it back on the shelf because they don't want that shit getting out there, right? And people finding out that they've got it. So they'll give you like a 20-year-old piece of kit to use instead, and you'll be walking around with like a phone the size of a brick, knowing that they've got something high speed on the shelf.
This is one of the most common conspiracies involving government organizations. He goes on to say that there's a lot more the government isn't telling us about.
It's like when you talk to the average Joe on the street about technology in the government, they're always like, dude, the stuff they have that they probably don't tell us about. How much of that is real?
Yeah, it's pretty real.
Have you seen some stuff that made you go, holy shit?
Yes.
They can do that?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. And
how much can you tell us?
Well, you know what? One thing that they're doing, and this is actually something I wanted to talk about today, because it's going to affect everybody.
Then Baker actually explains how these technologies work and what the CIA is using as their latest technology, and even more disturbing, what they're doing with it.
With the right stacked database, with the right information in that database, meaning the right amount of information about individuals, right? You constantly populating this database with new faces or with new photographs of individuals that you're going after. With enough of that to sift through, they're getting to the point now with no light conditions that they can identify positively the targets in that room or the targets in that facility or in that building, whatever it might be. And that's pretty incredible.
Baker goes on to say that they can even identify people by just their heart rate and other biological data, something that is absolutely mind-blowing. Not just this, but this technology extends to many other areas as well.
The universal soldier thing where it's the exoskeleton, it's the soft suit, it's all the data that you can acquire for that warfighter. How do you create the perfect environment on that individual as he's moving through an environment to be a more efficient, effective, lethal fighter? And things like that, identifying target, whether it's with a laser, whether it's with low light or no light conditions, where as you're rocking up on the target, you can do that. All these things, the ability to carry more gear, right? Hump it another extra, 10 kilometers, whatever it might be. It's pretty incredible what they're doing.
Joe Rogan then dives deeper into the idea of the universal soldier and explains that it could be similar to Elon Musk's Neuralink, a product that allows people to control technology. Check this out. Even recently, Neuralink was used by paralyzed individuals to access computers and even play games. But listen to what Rogan has to say here.
These the idea of this universal soldier thing. Have you been paying attention to this Elon Musk Neuralink thing that he's coming out with? Yep. Where they're going to somehow or another insert fibers into your brain and then have a Bluetooth-enabled device that you wear that's going to allow you to somehow or another interface with data at a much higher bandwidth. I don't know what the fuck any of those words mean I just said.
But that was good, though. That was good. It sounded like you understood it.
While Baker says this would most likely be too far and result in information overload, he does reveal that the government is developing other technologies that will actually allow them to monitor soldiers' health and vital signs in real time. In the end, though, he admits there's a lot more he can't talk about. Up next, Joe Rogan is met with Graham Hancock's theory surrounding ancient Egypt, involving the Younger Dryas, the use of ancient psychedelics, and ancient psychic powers. This is a conversation from episode 1284.
Well, I think people can develop these patterns of behavior that are destructive with anything, whether it's with alcohol or cannabis or, sex or anything. People get in ruts.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't mean that the cannabis is bad. It means that you are on a bad mental path.
Yes, exactly.
And, I'm not encouraging it for everybody because some people, it genuinely, biologically doesn't jive with them.
Yeah.
With Joe bringing up things that affect one's conscious, Graham explores how, in the ancient world, there was no government restrictions or societal constructs regarding the use of mind-altering substances, leading the people of that time to harness the power of psychoactive substances in different ways, perhaps even technological.
We, as adult human beings, need to take responsibility for our own lives and our own decisions. And we need not hand that responsibility over to governmental institutions, especially when it concerns something as intimate and personal as our consciousness. And my view is the ancient world had the right attitude to this kind of thing, and the modern world does not, and that we can sit down and learn a lot from the ancient world.
Graham explores this by first discussing lost civilizations and proposes their use of harnessing psychedelics.
A lot of people ask me, Hancock, you've been arguing that there's been a lost civilization in the human story, but what sort of civilization do you think it was? Well, one of the things I think is it was a civilization that used psychedelics. I think it was a civilization which pursued things in different ways. A lot of archaeologists have said to me, but we don't find any plastic bottles from the Ice Age. That means there was no advanced civilization during the Ice Age. Well, hang on. Maybe an advanced civilization might have decided never to get involved in plastic in the first place. Maybe they cultivated powers of the human mind that we dismiss and regard as completely unimportant, woo-woo.
Yeah, this is the thoughts about Egypt, correct?
Here Graham delves deeply into the Great Pyramid's chambers, exploring how the ancient Egyptians managed to fit large granite beams within the pyramid. He argues that once you do the calculations, it's impossible with the supposed level of technology the ancient Egyptians had access to which Graham specifies a different type of technology that perhaps we just don't have access to today.
The specific example I give is above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid are 5 further chambers. And these chambers are roofed and floored with granite beams that weigh about 70 tons each. And there are hundreds of them. And these 70-ton granite beams, which to put in context, a 70-ton beam is equivalent in weight to 35 large SUVs. These 70-ton granite beams have been elevated to a height of more than 350 feet above the ground and carefully and precisely placed in position.
Here's a diagram of the chambers within the Great Pyramid of Giza that Graham is talking about. These are the 5 located above the King's Chamber. The chambers are designed to distribute the weight of the pyramid's upper part, preventing the King's Chamber from collapsing. They are topped with large cantilevered slabs that form a pent roof. The chambers are floored and roofed with hundreds of granite beams that weigh around 70 tons each. As Graham questions how this is possible to build, he quickly addresses those who claim common sense theories, such as the ancient people building ramps to move these heavy beams.
It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage. You can say, oh, perhaps they built a ramp and hauled the stones up the ramp. But then you have to confront basic laws of physics. You can't haul a stone weighing tens of tons up a slope that exceeds 10 degrees. Then you start doing the calculation. How long a ramp do I need with a 10-degree slope to get to 350 feet above the ground? And the answer is you need a fucking long ramp, which should still be there.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't have been a sand ramp. It would have collapsed under the weight of those stones. It had to be as massive as the pyramid itself. So this begins to seem like an absurd idea, the idea that is foisted on us by archaeology.
Now, of course, today's science suggests this is impossible. Us humans today use machinery. It's the reason our societies are supposedly so advanced compared to those before us. But Graham explores that these were societies different to us, So who's to say they didn't have a completely different understanding of different technologies? After all, if you explained the internet to an ancient man, he'd scream magic.
Maybe the idea that they regard as absurd, namely that psychic powers were cultivated by ancient civilizations, that they could use powers of the human mind that we have allowed to lapse, maybe that idea deserves further consideration. We have gone down a path of leverage and mechanical advantage. We're used to relying on machines, but we hear anecdotal reports of people who have telekinetic powers, who can move things with their minds, of people who have telepathic powers. And our automatic reaction is to just dismiss all of that because science says it's impossible, because science regards consciousness as local to the brain and doesn't see how it can exert itself outside of that. But maybe we should open up to those possibilities, that we're dealing with a very different kind of culture that used techniques that we have allowed to lapse. And maybe we could wake those techniques up again. Maybe the ability of human beings to do almost superhuman things is resident within all of us, but sleeping.
Joe is quick to address that this is all speculative, but acknowledges the unfathomable structures that are the pyramids.
Well, it's pure speculation that they use some sort of a telekinetic power, but it's
pure
absolute,
speculation.
But it's absolute that they did something that we don't understand. If you think about the distance between us and the construction, just the modern accepted construction dates of the Great Pyramid, it's more than 5,000 years ago, or close to 5,000 years ago.
Great Pyramid is supposed to be about 4,500 years old, yeah.
That's really old.
It's incredibly
It's
old, yeah.
To think that someone back then could do something that would perplex us today with modern machinery.
Yeah.
And that somehow or another they figured this out. It's almost like what they had done was leave behind something that was so stupendous, so monstrously impressive that it would transcend time.
Yeah.
And that you would have to look at it even thousands and thousands of years later and say, hey, like this defies conventional explanation.
Joe and Graham then look at diagrams of the 5 chambers, and Graham points out where the granite stones were originally brought from by the ancient Egyptians, making the construction even more of an uncomprehendable feat.
And I've seen some of the conventional explanations of the construction of the pyramid, and they conveniently neglect those chambers above the king's chamber.
They do.
They conveniently neglect a lot of those massive stones.
Yeah.
And it's because it's one of those things you just go, I don't know. What is this, Jamie?
There are the chambers
is,
above the king's chambers, and each one of those floors consists of a row of 70-ton granite blocks that have been raised 350 feet above the ground. And not only that, but brought from Aswan in the south of Egypt, 500 kilometers south of the Great Pyramid.
Up next, Joe Rogan is confronted with the theory that the government is using DMT to talk to aliens. This is a conversation from episode 1255 with Alex Jones.
And then I've researched and I've talked to hundreds of people now, not on air, but I'm going to make a film on this, who've taken ayahuasca and DMT. I've not taken it, and for obvious reasons. And it's unbelievable because, I mean, they 100% in San Francisco is the main project site, literally have an alien base. And they are literally communicating, and they've got like astronaut level people taking super hardcore levels of drugs and going into meetings with these things and making intergalactic deals.
This theory sounds absolutely insane, but it's not the weirdest thing the government has done. Take a look at this study published on the official CIA website, where they admit to a remote viewing program previously funded by the government. But Jones ties this all back into the government, saying that he's talked to actual ranking officials.
Well, no, they'll cover that was on the show. They're not going to cover this. Because this is not my opinion. This is the real research that I have talked to Army generals, commanding generals, major generals, generals, CIA, everybody, and they're all 100%.
Here, Rogan presses Alex Jones on exactly who he means when he talks about the government intelligence.
The Books of Hermes. He describes how a procession of priests and savants, teachers, moved in very sacred, ritualistic order, each with an appropriate symbol and wearing certain insignia indicating the department of learning over which he presided. Clement also says that to earn these distinctions of learning, it was necessary for these scribes, scholars, and priests to have memorized certain books of Hermes, some 3 books, some 4 books, some 10 books. These various religious and philosophical teachers also carried emblems relating to the branches of learning over which they presided. Therefore, some of them had become masters of the medical books of Hermes, others of those books dealing with statesmanship and law and the government of peoples, others still of astronomy, mathematics, navigation, the secrets of the heavens, and the geography of the earth. Still others, in turn, of philosophy, of the deeper mysteries of the mind, of those sciences which are speculative, inductive, or theoretic, and still others, bearing those books and insignias which indicated that they were students of the divine mysteries concerning the nature of God, of deity, of the state religion, of the secondary deities and tutelaries, and all things which had to do with theology. Adding together the books specifically referred to by number but not by name by Clement, we find clear statement of 42 books, divided apparently into a wide variety of subjects. In short and simple, covering practically every field of knowledge known in the ancient world. Now we have here several facts of importance. The first is that Clement writes apparently as an eyewitness to these rituals, taking them for granted, and his contemporaries must have known whether he was correct or not, and it is unlikely that he would have perpetrated a fraud. It would have been too easy to detect it, and some other writers would certainly have come out violently against him. The second important point is dating, namely that this procession occurred probably not later than 220 AD, and possibly as early as 150 AD. This gives us a kind of orientation which brings us violently into conflict with one of the greatest antiquarians of his time, Fabricius. He declares it to be his most solemn and sincere conviction that the Hermetic books could not have been written prior to the year AD 300. Now here we come head on into one of our least minor problems. Is it conceivable that Fabricius was not aware of the statement by Clement? This is almost impossible. Had he not noted it himself, someone else would have brought it to his attention. He was working at a time when literature was not as abundant as it is now. Men did not overlook source books centuries ago, when these constituted practically the sum total of authority. Therefore, we try to understand why Fabricius took his position. The answer is obvious from other authorities working in the field. According to this answer, Fabricius assumes that the books carried by the Egyptians in their religious processional could not have been the present books that we now associate with Hermes. Fabricius would be inclined to follow the school with which he had greatest fondness, and take it for granted that the books referred to, that these books must have been in the Egyptian philosophy, in the Egyptian religion, and almost certainly in the Egyptian glyphic writings. He know today were undoubtedly written in Greek. Now, where we do not have many facts, positions can be strongly held. His position is sustained by the evidence of his time, but there were two things he didn't know. He couldn't know. One was the discovery in 1946 of the Canoboskian Library near Luxor, about 30 miles from Luxor in Egypt. This library proves conclusively that the Hermetic books were in existence prior to AD 300. And the general opinion now is that the manuscripts discovered will probably date from the middle of the 3rd century AD, or perhaps the beginning of that century. In other words, these books are practically contemporary with Clement of Alexandria, the man we quoted first. Now, the position that the Hermetic books had to have been written in Egyptian is also assailed by another fact, a fact which perhaps Fabricius did not adequately examine. That is, that considerably earlier, a Greek dynasty of pharaohs had taken over the administration of Egypt, and Egypt was already passing from Egyptian learning to Greek learning. This we evidence from the appearance of the Septuagint version of the Bible, which was actually prepared in Greek in Egypt, probably in the middle of the 4th century BC. Therefore, to say that Greek could not have originated in Egypt prior to the 4th century AD is no longer a tenable hypothesis. Also, we have another interesting point, one that we cannot overlook. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone gave us our first real clue to the Egyptian language. And it is important to us because it is a bilingual inscription in Egyptian glyphs and in Greek. Now, this is important to us for two reasons. First, because this stone was cut or prepared approximately 200 BC. The second point of interest is that this stone actually carries the name of Hermes. It is one of the words, of course, in the Egyptian form, Thoth. But it also carries another very interesting peculiarity by which we divide the Egyptian Thothic literature from the true Hermetic structure. We most of us realize or remember that Hermes is generally referred to in the Hermetic writings as Mercurius or Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest. And in some of the earlier works, this is modified a little, and he is called the twice greatest. But always this peculiar appellation of more than great accompanies the peculiar use of the term in the Hermetic literature. On the Rosetta Stone, the reference to Thoth is Thoth, great, great. In other words, twice great. And this carries with it an implication that is so close to our Hermetic problem that we cannot ignore it. Also, we know, therefore, that 200 BC, a sufficient study had been made and a sufficient interest had been created that a bilingual inscription relating to matters of importance had already assumed the proportion of a necessity. And in Egypt, Greek and Egyptian were both languages needed in the administration of the state 200 years BC. This brings the next point that involves itself in our peculiar situation. How early could these books have been compiled? Here another group of authorities move in. The effort now being to collate or to relate certain words and structure in the writings of Hermes with the existing versions of the Bible. This opens an interesting problem, and it is now generally regarded as likely, from a peculiar use of terms, that the author of the Hermetic works was to some degree acquainted with the Old Testament. The quotations that he appears to use, or the similarities which arise, are clearly to the Septuagint version, or the version that was actually prepared in Egypt. Also, references to the New Testament have been variously traced and implied, and this opens another interesting situation, namely that perhaps the author was acquainted with the New Testament, but the evidence to sustain this is less strong than that he was acquainted with the Old Testament. This brings another group of authorities into the picture, namely the recognition that ancient works passing downward over periods of time are frequently changed. A scribe or a translator working with a document and with certain liberty to either polish or refine the style of that document is very likely to fall into idiom, the idiom of his own time. Our outstanding example of that, of course, is the King James Version of the Bible. This version, prepared and published first in 1611, is a masterful translation into English. Yet any scholar examining the King James Version would date it almost certainly into the opening years of the 17th century. Not because the original contents belongs to that period, but because in the translation it has fallen into the idiomatic forms current at the time the translations were made. This can also have occurred in connection with the Hermetic writings. It is not at all impossible that versions or variants of these writings may have appeared at several times, and that these various editions might have been some in Egyptian, some in Greek, and that those in Greek, probably made by scholars, could easily be influenced by dominant books in the field of the literature of that time. So out of this entire rather involved and at the same time interesting detective story, we come to a series of rather negative facts. Actually, no authority has as yet clearly proven his point. It is not absolutely certain that words or peculiar constructions paralleling the Septuagint could not have come into the Hermetic writings at a time of their translation or transliteration from the Egyptian glyphs. Scribes and scholars could have polished the work in the temper of their own days. Nor is it at all impossible that other versions of the work may have been tampered with after the beginning of the Christian era. It is quite conceivable that efforts would be made by certain groups and certain sects to twist or move this group of literature into the Christian camp. On the other hand, certain other groups might have done everything possible to delete Old Testament parallels for various reasons. And later, in the period of the heresies, each translation could be changed, even as we observe changes in the Bibles of the various sects of the early Protestant Reformation. We have therefore only one essential fact that seems to be clear to us, namely that Clement was aware of the existence of some kind of a literature which does not exist in Egyptian glyphs in any manuscripts that we know today. He was aware of this literature as early as 175 AD. Cicero, flourishing approximately 100 BC, also refers to the Hermetic writings. Now, shall we say that these were Egyptian works now unknown, or were they the same general body of literature that we are now concerned with? There is nothing to indicate in the remarks of Cicero that he was referring to a particular or special kind of Hermetic writing. He took the attitude of referring to the subject as a corpus or body of literature. From what we are able to gather from these suggestions, and bearing in mind that Clement makes no concept or claim that this ceremony had been recently introduced, or that it differed from ancient and usual practices, we gradually move the date of the Hermetic literature back until, in all probabilities, we have some security as early as the 1st or 2nd century BC.
Yeah, it was a rip, right?
Beyond this point, we have not so great a security. And we are quite possibly involved in a situation that arose after the gradual decline of the Greek academies and the motion of Greek learning into the Egyptian theater. Now, why do we make a point of the difference between Greek and Egyptian in this case? Is there any reason to assume, for example, that these Hermetic books might not be merely well-polished Greek versions of more ancient Egyptian texts? This is a moot question. In favor of it, of course, is our comparatively inadequate knowledge of Egyptian religion. A knowledge, however, which is gradually filling in. And at last, our Egyptologists are beginning to worry themselves with some texts other than those of the old funereal rites. We're beginning to sense something of the dignity of Egyptian literature, something that we have not known until the last 25 to 30 years. However, against the belief that these works are simply a translation of earlier Egyptian doctrines, there are certain facts not to be overlooked. What we know today of Egyptian religion, what we have been able to piece together, even in more recent years, would lead us to the conviction that the Hermetic books are not orthodox Egyptian texts. They represent some kind of a change. They are not steeped in the Osirian ritual of the later Egyptian religion. They are not part of the great Amonism that preceded that. They show very little indebtedness to any structure of Egyptian learning which we now possess. There is, however, as Dr. Breasted has pointed out, and Budge of the British Museum supports this position, there is great possibility that mystical or secret sects existed in Egypt at an older time, and that these sects may already have begun the rationalization of their theological concepts, and that religious philosophy, as philosophy, may have arisen in Egypt at an earlier date than we realize. It has generally been ignored because we have not recovered adequate text evidence. If, as was the case in early Christian mysticism, this lack of adequate text is simply due to the fact it was not written, but was passed on as oral tradition or under obligations, or as Breasted suggests, the glyphs themselves may be susceptible of two complete systems of interpretation. We may then well be in the presence of a tradition long held orally and finally reduced to written form with the rise of the Greek period of culture in Egypt. This would be consistent because the coming of Greek learning to Egypt would have justified a large part of the Hermetic corpus. In other words, for the first time, the teachings of Hermes may well have become of interest to the average Egyptian, who was beginning to be cultured in the philosophical speculations of the Greeks. Egypt was reticent in these matters, because, of course, it claimed, as most ancient nations did, that itself it was the cradle of learning. It might therefore well have refused to wish to accept that a foreign teaching such as Greek was of primary importance, and may have attempted to prove that its own teachers and its own leaders of past times had originated this doctrine. Now let us see how that stands up, because we have an interesting point here. We know that in the 6th century BC, nearly all Greek scholars visited Egypt. We know that Pythagoras received a large part of his education from the Egyptians. We know that Plato visited Egypt, receiving the mysteries at Sais. We are perfectly well aware that Solon, in the 6th century, went to Egypt, and there he became instructed in the principles of laws, which he later reformed and applied to the needs of the Athenian states. All of these considerations must cause us to realize that Greek philosophy was indebted to Egypt. Yet in Greek philosophy, we do not find the elements of the Egyptian religion which flourished at the time of Pythagoras or Plato. We do not find Pythagoras returning with a hierarchy of Egyptian deities to impose upon the Greek mind. We do not find him returning with Egyptian religious rites, ceremonies, or rituals, although Pythagoras was profoundly concerned with ritualism. From what we can generally observe, the Pythagorean system was essentially derived from the Orphic, which in turn probably came originally from the Far East. Yet here we have Greeks going to Egypt, learning many things and returning to strengthen and unfold their own Grecian system of philosophy. Is it possible, then, that the return of Greek philosophy to Egypt, about the time of the rise of the Hermetic literature, was more than a coincidence? Is it at all conceivable that Pythagoras and Plato and Solon and others who made the same, at that time, difficult journey, actually received a teaching different from that of Orthodox Egyptian religion, and that in the mysteries of this teaching, they derived the principles of their own Greek system? If this is true, then there is no reason to doubt that the Hermetic tradition in Egypt, which in many ways is similar to the Greek, might well have been older than the Greek, and might have been communicated to those Greeks who later fashioned the Platonic and Peripatetic systems of philosophy, or even the Stoical and Cynical schools. All this gives us something else to worry about, which I think I add as a kind of a novelty, because as far as I can find out, the others have not been worrying about this point. This is a private worry of our own. There is every reason, then, to assume that being without knowledge of the actual facts involved, and having only circumstantial evidence upon which to build, we cannot preclude the possibility that the Egyptians did possess the rudiments of Hermetic philosophy earlier than the rise of Greek philosophy. This would seem to be more probable inasmuch as the Greeks borrowed from the Egyptians at a time when the Egyptians were not borrowing from the Greeks. In those days when Solon visited Egypt, the Egyptian priests referred to the Greeks as children, infants in learning, and Solon was inclined to agree with them and recognize the tremendous value of being allowed to become acquainted with the Egyptian system of law and political structure. All these situations lead together to refute the belief that is advanced by one authority as a pat solution to everything, namely that the Hermetic works were compiled by an individual who was interested in both Egyptian and Greek lore, and therefore, in all probability, was a moderate scholar in these different fields, perhaps living late enough to also indulge in Christian speculation. These points seem unreasonable, and I think that we have to recognize the probability that the so-called Hermetic tradition could have existed in Egypt without being directly involved in the state religion. It could have been a philosophical school. It could have been a group of sectaries of its own peculiar order, like the Essenes in Syria and the Therapeutae also in Egypt, though belonging to an entirely different conviction from the Egyptians. This gives us one other situation that we cannot afford to overlook, however, even though it becomes a little contrary to our desire. We must be perfectly fair in presenting the different sides of this situation. It has been a custom since the beginning of the written word for individuals, either for prestige or profit, or to bestow unusual dignity upon some production of their own, to ascribe that production to an ancient writer. We find this all through various works. For instance, as late as the 18th century, a whole group of works were attributed to Aristotle, in which he had no part at all, particularly an essay on midwifery that certainly would never have been Aristotelian. But these tracts, in order to gain a quick public, borrowed ancient names. Friar Bacon, Roger Bacon, was subject to the same type of fabrication. And it is even generally assumed today that books printed as late as 1800 were printed on old paper in old type and backdated to become more impressive. There is no way in which we can estimate what individuals will do to accomplish an end. It has been also the general experience of man that antiquity bestows authority. And wherever a subject wishes to have immediate recognition or to move into a sacrosanct position, it chooses to be appended to an ancient work. Thus, if we say that a work was written 50 years ago, it does not have the same prestige if we say that it was written 2,000 years ago. Antiquity seems to give us a certain sense of confidence. Also, it makes a remoteness, dividing the work from our common habits and dividing the author from the persons we may have known. We know what fabrications in various fields of literature have accomplished in this particular case or instance. Thus, it is always possible that the Hermetic writings were produced at some period, perhaps between the 3rd century BC and the 1st or 2nd century AD, and attributed to an earlier author. This attribution may not be as completely dishonest also as one might think, because even today we have a class of literature, particularly in metaphysical and mystical matters, in which various ancient persons are said to have revealed themselves, or to have dictated writings, or to have projected thoughts upon later writers. We have a considerable field of spiritualistic literature sustaining this position. We also have a number of minor religious movements of comparatively recent order or vintage, in which the essential teachings are attributed to miraculous circumstances and remote ages. If these things come through a kind of inspiration, if an individual entranced or under the pressure of vision seems to see, note, or be in contact with a remote scholar or a great teacher of the past, he may very well actually believe that some document dictated to him is actually attributable to the original author. This type of thinking we do find, and we find it quite honestly advanced. And with perhaps 18 or 1900 years of obscurity in between, it is very difficult for us to clearly demark these possibilities and to give them adequate consideration. I think one point is of very great interest to us, and that is that the history of Hermetic literature is loaded with a variety of unreasonable circumstances. Even after we pass out of the original Alexandrian center, where in some way this whole literature seems to have risen in this great North African melting pot of beliefs and doctrines, it moved into the Near East to involve or invite the speculations of the Arabs. They did a splendid job of speculating, by the way. Their extravagances added to the original uncertainty have not done anything to clarify the matter. But they did undoubtedly prepare commentaries and tracts, and in their own inimicable style had their own revelations relating to the Hermetic philosophy, so that just as we are indebted to them for a number of original Christian documents, so we can definitely say that we are indebted to them for a very remarkable group of Hermetic interpretations, expansions, revisions, and even a book or two that was not previously known to exist. Whether these actually were legitimate or whether they were invented, we have no way of knowing after so long a period of time. This also meant that the Hermetic philosophy returned to Europe. It returned through the Moors and through the Crusades and through the increasing contacts between the Near East and European scholarship. It came back to Europe, or reached Europe, in a blaze of glory. It became one of the great fashions and fads of the time, and Hermes grew in stature to such extent that he eclipsed even Aristotle for a while, and that was a considerable problem in eclipsing. Actually, however, in the interval, in its slow meanderings from Egypt via Arabia and into Spain, and from Spain up through southern Europe into the great centers of European culture in the medieval period, in this period of wandering, the Hermetic philosophy began to change its shape, change its presentation. Much of its so-called broadness was lost. The original books of Hermes came to be regarded as merely the outer surface of a larger literature, and the entire subject gradually emphasized its scientific import and became practically synonymous with medicine. Thus we have a complete literature dealing with the medical arts, and, of course, one of the prime elements in medicine, chemistry. Chemistry, of course, in those days was without boundaries such as we know now. Chemistry in China, in India, Arabia, was alchemy. And alchemy was a fantastic conglomeration of ancient beliefs and modern experimentation. The alchemists were not by any means a group of quacks, nor were they an assembly of madmen. They were devout persons, serious scholars, deep thinkers. And in their thinking and in their speculations, Hermes became their patron saint. And this ancient philosophical personality ultimately dissolved to become the symbolic figure of Mercury, Quicksilver, a chemical element. So in these long journeys, Hermes passed from a demigod of Egypt to a medieval element. Now that was quite a trip. And in the course of this traveling, another interesting thing occurred. During the 15th and early 16th century, a brand new literature accredited to Hermes appeared. For this literature, there is no history whatever. We know beyond reason or doubt that this literature arose from original sources, perhaps not earlier than 1400 AD and as late as 1500. But the name of Hermes began to appear on the titles, pages, and among the emblemata of alchemy. He became accredited with the preparation of chemical formulas, means of transmuting metals. He was even accredited with the discovery of gunpowder. Now, this is so totally different from the corpus hermeticum of ancient times that we must pause. Yet we must also remember the words of Clement of Alexandria in the Stromata, where he tells us that in this procession of priests there were some who carried the symbols of medicine, chemistry, and other arts. Upon perhaps this very slender foundation, Hermes was elevated to become the patron genius of medieval Hermeticism. This Hermeticism divided very definitely into two schools. One was that of the gold makers, whose philosophy was not, however, as superficial as we might think. They were convinced that there were analogies in nature, and that any law or pattern or process by which the regeneration of man could be achieved could also be used for the actual transmutation of base metals. On the hypothesis that all processes in nature have a certain uniformity and consistency, it was assumed that if man could save his own soul, thus transforming himself from a material to a spiritual creature, that he could also transform metals from the dross side of themselves to a more purified state, suitable for medicines and elixirs, suitable for the extension of life and perhaps the achievement of physical immortality. These gold makers, however, such as those who were so industriously occupied in the old Street of the Alchemists in Prague, Czechoslovakia, these alchemists were ridiculed by another group. This other group maintained that the entire Hermetic tradition, as it has now been called, dealt not with metals, but with the regeneration of the intangibles in human nature. If anything, they would have taken the position that if you can transmute metals, this proves you can transmute man. They would have reversed the polarity. They would have reversed the interest, affirming that the mere achievement of material wealth was an ignoble and unreasonable end, totally inconsistent with the divine destiny of man. These mystical gold makers then immediately began to reduce the chemical symbols and tracts and writings attributed to Hermes and other authors into metaphysical textbooks, books inclined to reveal that transmutation was a kind of yoga, a kind of mystical regeneration within the human being, the man himself being the alchemical retort in which these marvelous changes might take place. And these same mystics assumed that Hermes, representing Mercury, Quicksilver, representing this mysterious agent in which all elements can be reconciled, that Mercury therefore represents the reconciling power of human consciousness, or perhaps more exactly, of the human mind. For Mercury becomes the key, the master of the mystery, by means of which all things are unlocked. And the medieval man liked to think of reason as this power by means of which all mysteries could be solved, all good things could be accomplished, and the interval between man as a physical being and man as a spiritual being could be crossed or bridged through reason and illumination. Now, this would carry us back again to the Hermetic books by a circle. For in the Pymander of Hermes, we have no doubt whatever that Hermes is used in this work not only as a person, but as an embodiment or personification of universal mind. So your mystical alchemist seems to have retained the Hermetic tradition, although he passed it through a variety of symbolic processes. Your material alchemist lost it. And perhaps your material alchemist was the mad parent of the entire concept of modern material science, because he certainly was one of the first to conceive of the tremendous personal advantage to himself if he could control laws for profit. If, however, he was a mystic, he would control or direct laws only for the glory of truth. And this division on various levels has endured to our present time. With the rise of modern chemistry, the Hermetic tradition has more or less faded from our consideration. But this does not mean that interest in these old processes has entirely ceased. At the present time, as a fair authority on books and on rare books, I think I can say that there is still a tremendous demand, a tremendous learned reading public, desirous of securing any material relating to the Hermetic experiments of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. Any rare work which appears in this field is immediately purchased, disappearing again from the trade. I have talked to book dealers in this country and communicated with them in Europe, and it is rare indeed to find a rare alchemical text, regardless of price, remaining in a dealer's store for more than a few days. In other words, there's a market somewhere. The interest in these things continues, and there are people who are ready to pay $200, $300, $500 for one of these old books. The market is always greater than the supply. Reprints of these works are periodically made and become in their own condition rare books. And it is common knowledge that very few even reprints of the rarer Hermetic writings are available. They disappear almost instantly, not into public institutions, but into private libraries, where they are variously used. Thus we have another interesting point. 90% of these books are not going into the libraries of chemists, nor are they going into the collections of alchemists who have any intention of making physical experiments with the text. They're going mostly into the collections of philosophically minded persons who are concerned with the attempt to restore the lost symbolism of the Hermetic tradition. And in that respect, we might mention the work on Hermetic philosophy by Mrs. Sarah Atwood, one of the outstanding rarities of the last century. A very deep and serious study of the metaphysics of Hermes, the metaphysics of the great alchemical tradition, represented in Europe by several thousand valuable books, a tradition that rose mysteriously and with tremendous, spectacular intensity around 1550, and was completely forgotten, or at least had passed from all interest as far as the public is concerned, as early as 1700. In that 150 years or less, the entire restoration of alchemical Hermeticism had its course. And by the beginning of the 19th century, 1800 or even earlier, these books were rare and almost impossible to obtain. Now this gives us some general clue to a difficult problem. We have one or two other points that we want to make as clear as possible. As we have only numbers, such as the number 42 given to us by Clement, or perhaps the allegorical numbers of earlier writers who attributed to Hermes anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 volumes.
I had an
or
Ice
more.
Spice for 54.
These numbers are not represented by any available literature.
He's understairs.
The Hermetic fragments that we have today, and which are clearly separate from the other groups which we mentioned, the Neoplatonists, the Gnostics, and the early Christian church. These fragments are comparatively meager, yet reference is made to numerous others. What happened to them? Is it true that at some time along the way, these were drawn into secret society? That the alchemists at one time at least did possess access to these manuscripts or books? Is this possible? It is possible, but belongs in the sphere of romantic thinking.
Oh my God.
We have no serious evidence.
Right here.
Actually, only a few texts, the Pymander particularly, and the Asclepius, remain, which are completely and unitedly bound up with this tradition. These are surrounded by a vast array of borderline literature. Literature that seems to tip in almost any conceivable direction. There is even some evidence of alchemical writing in the Alexandrian period in Egypt. But this had not achieved the interest which we know today. We are aware, however, that the Egyptians experimented under the name of Hermetic art with the creation of synthetic gems.
I know, come here.
We know that they were able to copy in what was later called Roman paste most of the precious stones of antiquity. And because the art of the lapidary was at that time not very well known, it is quite possible that the fraud occurred in which synthetic stones were passed off as genuine. That these creations of artificial stones, the development of certain dyes for textile, for various purposes, the creation of malleable glass, or glass of itself that would bend. These ancient arts, like that of Greek fire, are known to have had some real existence.
Bro, like I'm 5, dog.
They were included in Hermetic thinking at that time, therefore indicating that the Hermetic system was regarded as scientific and having secrets useful on the level of practice and trade.
Keep going down.
This, again, is represented only by a meager circle of authority or traditional remains. How then shall we examine the books of Hermes out of the knowledge that we have of them? I think the answer lies in one direction only, namely that the Hermetic concept in itself must have had a school of some kind surrounding it. That these books appeared and remained simply isolated fragments of literature is inconceivable in the mind of the time. For in those days it would have been very difficult for any scribe to have remained concealed. It was not then possible to follow publishing procedure. These manuscripts had to have been circulated among at least a small group of friends, devotees, or dedicated persons who were at least partly aware of the facts. Thus, this literature could not have simply appeared and not have had any foundation in realities. In our discussion of the Pymander, which will come later, and which perhaps should have been introduced at this point in the planning of the series, but it wasn't, so we must follow the pattern. We have some interesting thoughts. In the Pymander, we have a general concept of universal procedure, a concept partly paralleling that of the Greeks, perhaps somewhat paralleling that which was later to become Gnosticism, and to a little degree at least, paralleling the early theological speculations about universals held by the Christian fathers. Very early, the church drew to it a certain number of scholars, and these began speculating outside of the jot and tittle of the approved canon. And the mind of man, once it has reached a certain size, cannot be further pressed back into an old pattern. So the church had to be prepared for men thinking forward rather than merely backward. This change in perspective in the various fields of learning is important to us because about the time that we attribute to the creation and circulation of the Hermetic writings, we find the basic Hermetic concepts beginning to influence thought outside of the school itself. We are told that Hermes, for example, wrote upon astronomy.
Yeah, they're right here.
And we can only pause to realize that Ptolemy of Alexandria, who was perhaps the greatest astronomer and geographer of the ancient world, and also the father of most modern astrological speculation, that Ptolemy's works move from the same premise of that of the Hermetic revelation. In other words, Hermes' universe is rather closely associated with the later developments of Ptolemy.
Party hard, son.
The concepts of geography and navigation are those of the Hermetic school and not of the other neighboring.
God, this kid is weird. Like, niggas.
The changes which took place in concepts of government and in the healing arts, the secularizing of medicine, and a variety of other subjects which moved and changed the face of the Mediterranean culture. These changes followed closely after the so-called original Hermetic period, and they followed even more closely the original ideas and concepts of the Hermetic school. So we'll then trace some of these ideas in an effort to try to show how they spread out into the literature of the time. We can see, for example, the rise of certain powerful intellectuals in the Roman Empire. It is a mistake for us to assume that the Romans were all ignorant. For from the beginning of the Roman culture to the final decline of Roman life under the coming of the Ostrogoths, the king Theodoric, up to this period, we see the continual structure of a Roman philosophy. And we find this moving through the thoughts and meditations of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, through the great hymns of the Emperor Julian, and finally to Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy. With this, the school closes. Julian, Boethius, and Marcus Aurelius all show Hermetic influence. They show the type of thinking which was peculiarly associated with that school, a kind of thinking which, while similar to Gnosticism, was not Gnosticism. Similar to Neoplatonism, was not Neoplatonism, and with certain Christian elements, was distinctly not Christian. Thus it is quite conceivable that down through this technically difficult period to record, when, as is so often the case, historians were interested only with war and not with culture, that a descent of belief and doctrine can be traced. Now we also know that one of the introductions which we find in the Hermetic writings is this important approach to the concept of mind. Now we know that Plato, Pythagoras, and Aristotle seemingly rather well exhausted our concept of the human mind. Yet in the Hermetic writings and in the Hermetic corpus, we find some new aspects of mentalistic thinking. We know, for example, that in most of the Greek schools, mind became an instrument. It was a wonderful and powerful means for the accomplishment of truth. Mind was therefore a kind of channel through which knowledge moved into the individual. But in the Hermetic tradition, we find something that departs from this and gives us a rather different perspective. The emergence